The room had fallen silent when a venomous voice rang out. "A black kid, 8 years old, and he dares to step into the court. Sit down, you're nothing but a joke here." Laughter erupted, heavy like blades slicing through the air. But Jalen Brooks didn't back down. He slammed his hand on the table, eyes blazing. "Justice is not a joke, and you're the one turning this courtroom into a circus by faking evidence." The words cut through the air like a knife. Judge Clark froze. The jury's mouths fell open in unison. The mockers were instantly silenced. That moment struck like a hammer to arrogance. A child bold enough to tear through the veil of abuse. And the message caught like fire. Justice does not bow to age or skin color, it bows only to the truth. The courtroom door opened, and light from the hallway spilled in, following the small footsteps of Jalen Brooks. He held his mother's hand tightly, a thin but steady grip, as they walked past rows of seats packed with people. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and paperwork, laced with cold stares aimed directly at the mother and son. A few men leaning against the wall lowered their voices in hushed murmurs, their mocking laughter sharp like blades. "Bringing a kid to court?" a hoarse voice muttered, prompting a few chuckles nearby. Jalen heard every word clearly, and in his eyes flashed a look far beyond his short 8-year childhood. To the crowd, he looked like an innocent child, but in that moment, his gaze held a calm coldness, as if he had long been ready to face ridicule. His mother gripped his hand tighter, trying to keep her composure. She knew every stare was loaded with judgment, treating their presence as a joke. She had grown used to that kind of contempt her entire life. But today, standing beside her son, the shame weighed tenfold. In the front row, Officers Turner and Miller leaned back in their seat, talking just loudly enough for others to hear. Turner jerked his chin toward Jalen, a smirk playing at his lips. "This little black kid showing up at court? Looks like he brought toys with him." Miller laughed out loud, the sound echoing through the room. A few others shook their heads and joined in, creating an atmosphere that felt half mocking, half disdainful. Jalen lifted his head, his deep black eyes locking directly onto Turner's gaze. He didn't cry, and he didn't retreat behind his mother like other children might. Instead, he held the stare, his eyebrows slightly furrowed, and his silence stood as a clear and quiet protest. Turner suddenly stopped laughing. His smirk stayed, but something about the boy's unwavering look unsettled him. There was something different about this child, a hard light in his eyes that made people instinctively wary. 3 sharp bangs of the gavel cracked through the room, pulling attention back to the raised bench. Judge Raymond Clark sat high behind a large wooden desk, black robe draped over folded arms. His eyes scanned the courtroom, pausing just a beat longer on Jalen. The corner of his mouth twitched, and then his voice came slowly, but with a sharp chill. "Don't let the boy be a distraction." The words landed like both a command and a verdict, deciding in advance the worth of the child's presence. To Clark, that 8-year-old boy meant nothing more than a nuisance, and he made no effort to hide it. The judge's words rang in Jalen's ears, making his heart sting for a moment. But instead of bowing his head, he tightened his grip on his mother's hand and met the moment head-on. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Some leaned in to whisper, "Court isn't a place for kids." A gray-haired woman in the back row muttered, "So pitiful," bringing the child just to beg for sympathy. Each comment felt like a whip, but instead of breaking him, they forged in Jalen a strange, growing resolve. His mother took a deep breath, trying to stay calm as she led her son to the defendant's bench. She knew today was more than just a trial that would decide her fate. It was also a test for her young son. Jalen sat down, back straight, eyes fixed on the judge's bench. His lips pressed together slightly. He didn't fully understand everything that was about to happen, but he knew one thing: he couldn't let his mother face humiliation alone. On the jury bench, a few people exchanged glances that blended surprise and disdain. A man with a beard leaned in and whispered, 8 years old, what does he know about justice? The person next to him replied, "Just trying to win pity, that's all." Those words hit Jalen like sparks. In his mind, he saw the long night spent reading his grandfather's old law book, the words he had painstakingly sounded out, the faded blue ink notes in the margins. It wasn't just reading for fun. It had become part of his memory, a kind of belief that justice could be understood even when you were only 8. Raymond Clark leaned back in his chair and struck the gavel again, signaling the start. His voice rang out, "Court is now in session. Maintain order." His eyes were as cold as a wall. To him, this was just a minor case. Something to be handled quickly, not worth real attention. But what he didn't know was that in this room filled with mocking laughter, an 8-year-old child was about to turn everything into a shockwave. Tense silence took over for a brief moment before the prosecutor stood up, about to open with the charges. But at the defendant's bench, Jalen Brooks sat unmoving, his eyes still locked onto the judge's bench like a small flame waiting to ignite. And it was that gaze, steady, resolute, and unshaken, that would become the true starting point of everything about to shake this courtroom to its core. Prosecutor Keene stood up, her voice sharp as a blade, launching a series of rapid-fire questions about Jalen's mother's testimony. The woman seated at the witness stand lowered her head, her voice trembling as she responded, struggling to stay composed under dozens of piercing stares. But before she could finish her sentence, Officer Turner's scornful laughter cut through the solemn air. He leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, and spat out, "Maybe let the kid defend her. Bet he learned law from cartoon." His laughter echoed across the courtroom, triggering a few more laughs, each one like an invisible blade slicing through the dignity of the woman on the stand. Jalen sat beside her, his dark eyes suddenly blazing. The blood in his veins boiled, and his small hand clenched until his knuckles turned white. He abruptly stood up, his voice ringing out loud and clear, cutting through the noise and stopping the laughter in its tracks. "I understand my mother's rights, and you just insulted her in court." Jalen's voice didn't tremble. Each word dropped firm and heavy, shaking the entire courtroom. All eyes turned to the 8-year-old boy, stunned, disbelieving, as if he had just done something beyond comprehension. Turner flushed red, sitting up straight, rage flaring like a wound to his pride. He shouted, his voice growling over the murmurs, "Sit down! This isn't kindergarten." The words bounced off the wooden walls, dry and harsh. But Jalen didn't flinch. His eyes gleamed like steel catching firelight. His calm defiance tightened the atmosphere in the courtroom until it felt suffocating. Judge Raymond Clark slammed his gavel down hard, the sound crashing through the room. He barked, "Order! I said order!" Yet instead of restoring silence, the gavel struck only to stir louder whispers. In the back rows, spectators leaned in, some frowning with discomfort, others staring wide-eyed as if witnessing something unbelievable. Jalen's mother turned to look at her son, her eyes full of worry, pride, and fear all at once. She hadn't had time to stop him. It all happened too fast. She knew her child was different from the rest, but she also knew this kind of boldness could make him a target for ridicule and retaliation. Turner slammed his hand on the seat, glaring at the boy, his eyes brimming with fury on the verge of spilling over. Beside him, Miller let out a cold chuckle, his voice low, but loud enough to be heard. "This kid really doesn't know his place." Prosecutor Keene, who had been ready to resume questioning, suddenly paused, clearly annoyed. She stepped forward and leaned down to face Jalen, her smile dripping with sarcasm. Quite the surprise. An 8-year-old standing up in court. But the law's not a game, kid. Her words were bait, aimed to draw support from the doubtful crowd. But instead of backing down, Jalen remained standing, his small hands resting firmly on the edge of the wooden table, his voice clear and unwavering. "The law isn't a game, and it's not something for police to mock." A wave of murmurs surged through the courtroom. A few jurors leaned toward each other, whispering. An older man nodded slowly, while the woman next to him covered her mouth in surprise. Clark struck the gavel once more, his face tightening, though something flickered behind his eye. Hesitation. He hadn't expected the boy to strike directly at the court's weakest point, the contempt and abuse of power by the police. Turner jutted his chin, his voice hissing through clenched teeth. "Is this kid teaching law to the whole court now? You think you're smart, huh?" Jalen turned to face him, eyes blazing, and with a voice as clear and forceful as an accusation, he answered, "Being smart doesn't matter. What matters is the truth, and anyone can see the truth." That reply caught Turner off guard, and the courtroom felt split in two. Half looked at Jalen with admiration, while the other half simmered with unease, watching the usual power structure begin to tilt. For a moment, the air froze. Every mocking laugh from earlier had vanished, replaced by suffocating tension. Raymond Clark leaned forward, elbows on the bench, his eyes locked on Jalen. He spoke slowly, each word dropping like a hammer. "That's enough. This is a serious courtroom, not a playground. If it happens again, I'll have to ask you to leave." Yet what truly silenced the room was not the warning. It was the way Clark said the word "you," for the first time acknowledging Jalen not as a disruptive child, but as someone present, real, and undeniable. Jalen's mother gasped, clutching his hand as if to pull him back down. But Jalen only gave a small nod, then slowly sat, his eyes still glowing, fearless. Turner dropped into his seat, muttering a curse under his breath. But deep inside, something in him had shifted. The challenge hadn't come from a seasoned lawyer or a sharp-tongued judge. It had come from an 8-year-old boy who had just forced him to swallow his own mocking words. Amid the chaos in the courtroom, one thing became clear. Jalen Brooks had broken through the first barrier. He was no longer seen as a joke. He had become the one everyone had to stop for, to listen to question. And this was only the beginning of the fierce confrontation ahead, where that small but brilliant mind would continue shaking the very foundation of power in this courtroom. The tension in the courtroom still hung taut like a stretched wire after the clash with Turner. Eyes had yet to drift away from Jalen when Prosecutor Keene stepped forward, her heels hitting the wooden floor with dry, deliberate thud. She stopped in front of the witness stand, her eyes full of disdain as they swept down toward the boy sitting next to his mother. There was no pity in her stare, only the arrogance of someone convinced power belonged to her. She raised her voice, dragging out each word for the entire courtroom to hear. Third grader talking law? The question wasn't meant to be answered, only to humiliate. Her voice dropped, laced with a cold smile, meant to crush the flicker of courage that had just flashed from Jalen. The room went silent. The whispering vanished, leaving a heavy stillness, as everyone waited to see how the 8-year-old would respond. Jalen sat straight, unflinching, not timid, eyes fixed on Keene. His lips pressed together briefly before he spoke, his voice steady, every word striking against the wall of prejudice. According to the Sixth Amendment, my mom has the right to a fair trial. His child's voice echoed through the solemn room, clear, simple, but weighted enough to jolt people upright. He didn't answer with childish emotion, didn't cry, didn't beg. He quoted a clause from the U.S. Constitution as naturally as breathing. A moment of silence lingered. The jurors looked stunned, some leaning toward each other, eyes wide in disbelief. A middle-aged man raised a hand to his mouth, his expression caught between shock and respect. The blonde woman beside him whispered, "Did he just say the Sixth Amendment? An 8-year-old?" That whisper spread quickly through the courtroom, turning into a wave of astonishment. Keene froze for a second, her face stiff as if slapped. She hadn't expected the boy to know the law so precisely, but she clenched her teeth, the sneer returning to her lips as she hissed, "You insolent brat." The word brat hit like a slap, laced with humiliation, the bitterness of someone being challenged on the very stage of power she believed was hers alone. Jalen didn't respond with anger. He stared directly at Keene, his dark eyes like a mirror reflecting her back to herself, forcing her to feel the challenge in his calm defiance. In that moment, the courtroom sensed a shift in balance. A seasoned prosecutor was now sparring with a child, and the grave silence of the jury showed clearly who held the upper hand. Judge Clark, seated above, tilted his head slightly, a glint of reflection in his eyes. He had once dismissed Jalen as a disruptive child, but now, within the thick tension of the room, even he was listening. The gavel remained untouched. Clark wanted to see where this confrontation would lead. Turner, still bitter from being challenged by Jalen earlier, let out a harsh laugh. Sixth Amendment or 72nd, it means nothing if a kid just parrots it. His bitter laughter echoed, but this time no one joined in. The jury didn't laugh. The spectators in the back remained silent. They no longer saw a joke. They saw an 8-year-old forcing adults to confront the cracks in their own conduct. Jalen's mother turned to her son, eyes welling up, not from fear, but from overwhelming pride. She knew this moment would be etched into their family's history, and perhaps the community's as well. A child had dared to stand up and fight back against cruel mockery, not with tears, but with intellect. Keene clenched the folder in her hand, the paper rustling, then lifted her chin high, trying to maintain authority. But the grit in her jaw had already revealed what the courtroom now sensed. She had been shaken. A prosecutor with decades of experience, who had broken down countless witnesses, now had to face the truth that an 8-year-old boy could silence a jury, could erase every mocking laugh. Jalen sat back down, his hands resting on his knees, but his gaze stayed locked on Keene. He knew this wasn't the end, only the first step in a long confrontation. In this courtroom, where the law was said to reign supreme, an 8-year-old had forced everyone to acknowledge that justice was not a privilege reserved for adults. And that, more than any spoken line, was a direct blow to the arrogance that blanketed the room. The whispers hadn't even died down after the exchange with Prosecutor Keene when a sharp, dry laugh rang out from the police section. Officer Miller, his face flushed red with anger and arrogance, threw his head back laughing before leaning forward, his voice shrill and piercing. "This black kid thinks he's smarter than a lawyer." The words weren't just aimed at Jalen. They sent a ripple through the courtroom. A few suppressed laughs slipped out from the corners of the room, but were quickly swallowed by the tension radiating from the 8-year-old sitting upright in front of them. Jalen didn't retreat. He slammed his small hand against the cold wooden surface, the sharp sound making several people flinch. He lifted his head, speaking clearly and firmly, every word like an accusation. "If the police fake evidence, the law calls that illegal." His childlike voice rang out, pure yet weighty, falling into the thick air choked with prejudice. Every word Jalen spoke ripped through the mask of authority worn by those officers. Miller froze for a moment, then his face flushed crimson, blood rushing to his ears. He braced himself against the bench, leaning toward Jalen, eyes blazing. "You accusing me of something, boy?" His outburst burst forth like fire, mixed with an unmistakable panic. The courtroom erupted in noise. Some jurors shook their heads. Others sat gaping. They couldn't believe an 8-year-old had just named a cop's wrongdoing right in court, a place where grown witnesses still trembled under pressure. Jalen didn't flinch. He held his gaze steady, eyes shining, hands still resting on the table, as if anchoring his truth. He wasn't asserting himself, he was asserting justice. That clarity made Miller suddenly appear powerless, even in his uniform, even with the weight of authority strapped to his belt. Judge Raymond Clark, who had remained cold and dismissive of Jalen's presence from the beginning, now sat upright, hands clasped on the wooden bench. He studied the boy closely, his expression shifted, first irritation, then discomfort, and finally, visible surprise. Clark realized Jalen's words weren't childish defiance. They were legally sound. He drew in a slow breath, sensing something he couldn't quite explain. Turner glanced at his partner, his smirk gone, replaced by rare unease. He knew Miller had just exposed a weak spot. An 8-year-old had publicly accused a police officer in front of the jury, the judge, and everyone present. No one could call it a joke anymore. Jalen's words had struck the fault line in the entire case. In the courtroom, an old man shook his head and whispered, "God, that boy said what most adults wouldn't dare." A young woman placed a hand over her chest, breath catching, eyes shining as if she had just witnessed something extraordinary. The murmurs rippling through the room were no longer mocking. Now they carried astonishment, reflection, and shame for the laughter that had come before. Miller bit his lip, unable to find a response. The word insolent that Keene had used earlier could still garner some sympathy, but Jalen's direct accusation had cornered them. If either the prosecution or the police slipped even once, the truth would be exposed clearly. Turner forced a weak smile, muttering, "What does a kid know anyway?" But even his voice sounded deflated, like someone clinging to a sinking ship. Jalen turned to his mother, gripping her hand tightly. The woman leaned down, eyes full of tears, yet glowing with an unusual light. In her gaze was fear for her son's boldness, but also pride she couldn't hide. She knew her child was risking his childhood against the scorn of the entire system, but she also knew he did it to protect her, to preserve the truth. Judge Clark tapped his finger lightly on the bench, eyes fixed on the file in front of him before looking back at Jalen. He understood that if a child could recognize the illegality in the evidence, then this court had no choice but to take a hard look at itself. He didn't make any ruling at that moment, but his prolonged silence and upright posture made one thing clear to the room. The scales of justice had just shifted. The entire courtroom sank into breathless silence. Every trace of mocking laughter had vanished. In its place was a compressed tension, with every gaze fixed on Jalen Brooks, the 8-year-old who had made a police officer falter, a hardened prosecutor freeze, and a previously indifferent judge sit up straight. That moment was not just a confrontation, it was a turning point. From then on, Jalen was no longer seen as a joke, but as a real opponent, despite how new he was to the world. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating after the fiery exchange with Officer Miller. All eyes were fixed on Jalen, an 8-year-old boy who had left uniformed men stumbling over their own word. The whispers had temporarily faded, replaced only by the rhythmic tapping of Prosecutor Keene's pen on the folder, like a countdown ticking before something detonated. She looked up, took a deep breath, and walked to the center of the courtroom, her heels pounding against the wooden floor in a firm rhythm meant to mask her unease and reclaim control. She pulled out a stack of papers from her file, raising them high for the jury and judge to see. "This is official evidence, a report with timestamps and verified signatures." Her voice rang out, deliberately emphasizing each word to bury the echo of Jalen's challenge. Every eye turned toward the papers in Keene's hand. Some people nodded, as if the documents marked the end of all argument. But just as Keene placed them on the table, Jalen leaned forward, his eyes glowing with an intense focus. His small hand rested on the table's edge as he scanned the printed lines quickly. Then, suddenly, he stood up, his voice sharp and defiant. "The dates don't match. The signature is fake." His words cut through the air like a blade, each syllable ringing out and shaking the courtroom. A terrible silence fell. People in the back rows stared wide-eyed, mouths open. The jurors turned to each other, some frowning, others whispering urgently. No one was laughing anymore. The mockery had vanished, replaced by real, unshakable shock. An 8-year-old had just exposed the fatal flaw in the prosecution's evidence. Judge Raymond Clark jolted forward, squinting hard at the file on his bench. He picked up a page, examined it closely, and saw what Jalen had seen. The date on the report did not match the date of the signature. His brows pulled tight as he muttered in disbelief, "How did a child see this?" The question wasn't directed at Jalen. It slipped out in raw astonishment from a man who believed he had seen every trick the courtroom had to offer. Clark had witnessed countless cases and brilliant attorneys. Few had spotted a flaw in a glance that the prosecution hadn't even bothered to cover. Keene turned pale, her hands clenched into fists, eyes flicking from the file to Jalen, her arrogant smile nowhere to be found. "It's just a clerical error," she insisted, but her voice lacked confidence, final syllables trembling. To the jury, her words sounded like a flimsy excuse. Officer Turner snorted, trying to laugh it off, but his chuckle fell flat in a courtroom now burning with the shock delivered by Jalen Brooks. One member of the jury, his hair snow-white, spoke in a calm, thoughtful tone. "The boy is right. I can clearly see the signature was dragged. It doesn't look real." That confirmation from an outside observer hit like a hammer against the foundation Keene had just tried to reinforce. Others began nodding, their expressions shifting into doubt. Miller sat stiffly, his hand unconsciously gripping the edge of his seat. He knew that if the document was suspected of being falsified, the fabrications he and Turner had built would be dragged into the light. Jalen remained standing, eyes shining, his small hand pointing to each detail on the paper as if he were teaching a classroom. "The date written here is after my mom was already arrested, so how could she have signed it? And the handwriting isn't consistent. It looks like someone tried to copy her style." His voice was clear and steady, filled with a confidence that many adults lack. The courtroom began to stir. People whispered to one another with words like, "He's right, that kid is sharp," and "the police messed up," echoing throughout. Eyes turned toward Turner and Miller, men who once laughed, now motionless, their faces drained of color. Clark slammed the gavel hard, the heavy sound pulling all attention back to the bench. He stared straight at Prosecutor Keene, his voice low and sharp. "Explain this." Keene bit her lip, quickly flipping through the file, but she saw the inconsistency as clearly as anyone. She mumbled, "It could be an error in the evidence collection. I'll double-check." But the words were too weak to fix anything. The jury sat in silence, their eyes firm, their confidence shaken at its core. Jalen's mother sat frozen, her trembling hand clutching his. A wave of emotion surged through her that words couldn't hold. She didn't know where her son had found such courage, but she knew one thing for sure. Jalen was no longer the child who hid behind her. He was standing in front of the entire system, protecting her with knowledge and resolve. A long, heavy silence filled the room, as if everyone was struggling to swallow the truth now laid bare. Jalen sat down, but his eyes remained locked on the file, ready to rise again if dishonesty dared to show itself. Turner kept his head down. Miller avoided the jury's eyes. Keene clutched the file like someone holding ashes. That moment was the real explosion. From cruel mockery, the story had flipped into a turning point, a place where an 8-year-old boy had exposed deception in front of those who embodied authority. The courtroom was no longer a place for ridicule. It had become a battleground for truth, where every eye was forced to acknowledge that justice could be defended by the clear voice of a child. And in the jury's stunned silence, a new belief quietly ignited. Jalen Brooks was no joke. He was the one making justice real again. The air in the courtroom remained thick after the stunning reversal when Jalen exposed flaws in the prosecution's evidence. Many eyes were still fixed on the boy, as if trying to confirm that what had just happened wasn't an illusion. In the crowded back rows, a young law student named Daniel sat pressed against the wall. From the start of the hearing, he had watched intently, occasionally jotting notes in a small note, but when Jalen spoke out in rebuttal, Daniel's hand trembled slightly. He realized this wasn't just a rare moment in legal history. It was a living example of everything he was studying. Unable to hold back, he quietly pulled out his phone, hidden in his palm, and began recording. The camera shook slightly from nerves, but the frame was clear. An 8-year-old child boldly calling out police misconduct in front of the judge and jury. When the gavel of Judge Clark brought the tense questioning to a close, Daniel stopped recording, his heart pounding. He knew that if this video reached the outside world, it would cause a stir. That afternoon, at a small cafe near campus, he opened his laptop, plugged in his headphones, and reviewed the footage. Jalen's voice rang through the speakers. "The dates don't match. The signature is fake." Daniel shivered, realizing the power of the moment came not just from the sharp logic, but from the visual contrast. A small child standing up to a hardened system. He didn't hesitate. He titled the clip, "8-Year-Old Outsmarts Cops in Court," and hit upload. Within just a few hours, the video began circulating. At first, it spread within the law student group at school, then gradually moved beyond. The headline, short and shocking, grabbed attention easily. Those curious enough to click couldn't believe their eyes. An 8-year-old boy, standing in a courtroom, slamming his hand on the table and speaking with such clarity that prosecutors and police fell silent. That image spread like wildfire. On social media, 2 new hashtags emerged and quickly exploded: Kid Lawyer and Justice Boy. People tagged the clip with those names, turning them into symbols. Within a single afternoon, the video had passed millions of views. Online news outlets quickly picked it up, posting headlines like, "8-year-old teaches police the law," or "Tiny child silences the courtroom." Comments poured in, full of outrage, admiration, and disbelief. One person wrote, "A grown officer loses to a child." Another added, "If an 8-year-old can see the lies, how much longer will we pretend not to?" Longer comments offered legal analysis. Some law professors cited the Sixth Amendment that Jalen had quoted, using it as proof that justice isn't some distant concept. Each comment added fuel to the growing firestorm of public opinion. In distant neighborhoods, people watched the video on their phones, chatting about it in diners, at bus stops. The image of young Jalen Brooks with blazing eyes and a steady voice became a heated topic of conversation. Those who had suffered injustice within the legal system saw in Jalen a source of comfort, a flicker of hope that truth could still be spoken, even if it came from the voice of a child. Parents shared the clip with notes that read, "Believe in your kids. They see more than we think." The video's explosion wasn't just about a strange courtroom scene. It was the striking contrast. A small black child standing before rows of uniformed adults, daring to say what many grown-ups never would. The headline, "8-year-old outsmarts cops in court," landed like a punch to the pride of the local police force. The more people watched, the louder the criticism grew toward Turner and Miller, the same men who had once laughed. Keene, back in her office, opened her phone and froze as she saw her own face in the now viral video. The part where Jalen corrected her, her expression cracking under pressure, became the most replayed moment. She clenched her jaw, pride deeply wounded. Turner and Miller were hit with online outrage. The police department's inbox overflowed with angry messages. "You're a disgrace, exposed by a child." At a small roadside diner, a group of truck drivers passed around a phone, watching the clip. They burst out laughing at Miller's stunned expression, then slapped the table in approval as Jalen said, "If the police fake evidence, the law calls that illegal." One older man sighed, "I've lived 40 years and never seen anything like this. That kid made me believe justice still exists." Jalen had no idea his video was going viral. He sat quietly in his family's small room, clutching his grandfather's worn law book, rereading the lines that had already become part of his memory. His mother, though still fearful about the upcoming trial, couldn't hide a smile as she watched her son deep in study. She didn't yet know the world outside was calling him Kid Lawyer or Justice Boy, but she knew in her heart that Jalen had become her true source of strength. The video's explosion marked the beginning of a storm no one in that courtroom could have foreseen. It wasn't just a recording, it became a symbol of truth, rising against false power. And as the view count kept climbing, as the comments piled higher, one thing became clear. Jalen's mother's case was no longer a private matter. It had become the center of public attention, where justice and abuse were now forced to face each other in the open light of public judgment. The next morning, as sunlight touched the glass-covered buildings in the city center, digital newspapers, large and small, erupted with a short but explosive headline: "8-year-old freezes the judge." Just 5 words, yet they captured the paradox that stunned the entire country. The featured image showed Jalen Brooks standing upright in court, eyes blazing, hand resting on the evidence folder, mouth mid-sentence as he delivered his accusation, while Judge Clark leaned forward, his face visibly shocked. Readers didn't need to finish the article to know something extraordinary had happened, and that alone drew hundreds of thousands of clicks within just a few hours. Social media exploded with debate. Half the internet praised Jalen as a young genius, a star shining in a courtroom often rigid and full of bias. They shared the video with proud captions: "This kid just gave the system a lesson in justice." And, "If an 8-year-old can see the truth, what excuse do the rest of us have?" Jalen's image became profile pictures, cover photos, and even printed on t-shirts with his quote turned into a rallying slogan. But on the other side, doubt spread quickly. Some claimed it was all a staged performance, insisting no child could possibly understand the law that well. On debate forums, threads lit up. One person wrote, "He just memorized a few lines. Don't turn him into a saint." Another added, "No way this kid pulled that off alone. Someone is behind this." Those words spread fast, planting seeds of skepticism and dividing public opinion into 2 clear camps. Officer Turner didn't miss his chance. On local television, he lifted his chin, straightened his tie, and delivered what he thought would restore his reputation. The boy is just parroting. He memorized a few lines from a book and repeated them. We can't let emotion interfere with justice. His condescending remark spread instantly, but not in the way Turner had hoped. Within minutes of the broadcast, social media struck back. One user commented, "You're only calling it parroting because he exposed you." Another wrote, "If parroting can uncover fake evidence, maybe the whole police force should start parroting too." Thousands of shares poured fuel on the fire, turning Turner's quote into a viral joke. Memes popped up everywhere, showing his face next to Jalen's upright stance, with the caption, "Who's really parroting?" While the world outside argued and fractured, Jalen sat quietly in his family's small room, unaware he was now the center of a storm. He pored over his grandfather's old law book, whispering each line the way he had hundreds of times before. His mother sat nearby, eyes filled with worry and pride, knowing that all the noise outside would eventually reach their door. Back online, the war of words grew more intense. Entire community groups created forums dedicated solely to discussing Jalen Brooks. One side praised him, calling him kid lawyer and justice boy, while the other insisted it was all a staged act meant to attack the police. In morning coffee shops, on buses, in classrooms, people talked about nothing else but the 8-year-old who stood up against the entire system. National television programs joined in. A live debate show featured two guests, a well-known attorney and a former police chief. The attorney smiled and said, "What that boy did was not simple. Only true understanding and exceptional memory could produce that kind of response in court." The former chief disagreed, claiming the public was being swayed by emotion. But when the video played live on air, showing Jalen slamming his hand on the table and saying, "If the police fake evidence, the law calls that illegal," the studio went silent. The host tilted their head and asked quietly, "If that's parroting, why do adults shake when they're exposed?" That question became a viral quote just moments after the broadcast. In the Black community, Jalen was seen as a small but powerful symbol. Many parents told the story to their children, teaching that justice isn't always far away and that even a child can recognize the truth. In one elementary school, a teacher played the clip during class. Students cheered. A few stood up mimicking Jalen, slamming their hands and shouting, "Fake evidence is illegal." The whole room laughed, but beneath the laughter was something deeper. The children understood they had a voice. Within police circles, the reaction was different. Many felt insulted, believing their profession's honor was under attack. Some publicly supported Turner, calling Jalen a tool of the media. But many young officers quietly shared the video, admitting the boy had touched on something they too could feel: the rot inside the very institution they wore on their sleeve. Day by day, the divide deepened. But that divide only made the storm grow wider, as every criticism brought hundreds of counter-arguments. Each time Turner appeared to dismiss the situation, the internet responded with waves of mocking memes. Every skeptical article became another chance for Jalen's supporters to prove he was right. Judge Clark could not escape the whirlwind either. One headline showed his photo with the caption, "The man frozen by an 8-year-old." A man used to solemn authority in court suddenly found his image spreading everywhere. Clark sat in thought, wondering what had made him, an experienced judge, concede truth through the voice of a child. He never said it out loud, but deep down, he knew Jalen had touched something beyond legal codes. Meanwhile, in the quiet corners of the city, some families gathered around small screens, watching the clip over and over together. They whispered to each other, "If that boy can stand up, then so can we." To them, Jalen was no longer a distant figure from the headline. He was a beam of light cutting through their lives, where injustice had once silenced them. The community was divided, but no one remained indifferent. The event had pushed the story far beyond the bounds of a local courtroom. It had become a national conversation about justice, about age, about truth, and about power. And amid all the noise and debate, one undeniable truth slowly emerged. No one could look away from the image of Jalen Brooks, the 8-year-old boy who dared to stand tall in court, who dared to speak the truth while grown-ups looked down. Before the public divide could settle, the local police department suddenly released an official statement on Monday morning. The document appeared on the department's website and was quickly picked up by major media outlets. At the top of the statement, one bolded sentence sent shockwaves: "Don't let a child bend justice." That cold line struck directly at Jalen Brooks, transforming the 8-year-old from a small witness into a public target. Though the statement never mentioned his name, everyone understood who it referred to. The department claimed the legal process must be respected, that public opinion was being swayed by emotion, and that justice could not rest on the immature words of a child. The backlash was immediate. Social media lit up in fury, thousands of angry comments appearing just minutes after the statement went live. People flooded the police department's page with outraged messages: "Cowards for attacking a child," and You're not defending the law, you're hiding the truth. The outrage spread like a fire soaked in gasoline, erupting even more fiercely than the days before. Images of Jalen in court, his bright eyes, his hand slamming the table, were shared millions of times, now accompanied by fierce messages of support. People no longer called him just kid lawyer or justice boy, but saw him as a symbol of truth under attack. The outrage turned into collective power. Posts poured in. If a child dares to speak up, we have no excuse to stay silent. In the legal world, prominent voices began to weigh in. In a national newspaper, Harold Green, a lawyer known for his work in human rights cases, published a lengthy op-ed. He wrote, "Jalen Brooks did not bend justice. He simply did what those in power failed to do. Look at the file and speak the truth. If an 8-year-old sees wrongdoing, our shame should not be that he spoke up, but that adults ignored it." The article was shared widely, gaining hundreds of thousands of likes and supportive comments. Green was not alone. A wave of lawyers began speaking out. On television, a black female attorney gave an emotional statement. "Jalen doesn't represent innocence. He represents raw justice. Don't turn that boy into a scapegoat for protecting those who abuse power." Each statement fueled the fire. The more respected figures spoke, the harder it became for the police department to hold its position against Jalen. The tipping point came when international human rights organizations took notice. They shared the video of Jalen exposing the falsified evidence, adding pointed commentary. A strong justice system does not tremble at the truth. Even when the truth comes from a child, those words were translated into multiple languages and spread across the globe. Meanwhile, the original clip recorded by Daniel continued to skyrocket in views. The number quickly reached 1 million in just a few days. Every time someone hit the share button, the clip became part of the growing wave of outrage and determination to resist abuse of power. A new movement emerged, with the phrase "Stop Police Abuse" used as a rallying cry. Overnight, the phrase appeared everywhere, in social posts, in opinion articles, even in hand-drawn pictures by children spreading across the internet. Turner and Miller became symbols of disgraceful abuse. Photos of them in court, sneering as they mocked Jalen, were reposted alongside thousands of harsh criticisms. Someone created an image of them studying an elementary law book with the caption, "Parroting like the 8-year-old." The sarcasm spilled beyond social media and into real life. On a university wall, students taped posters showing Jalen standing before the judge, with the words, "Justice doesn't fear the truth." The police department held an emergency meeting to plan a response, but the more they tried to deny or dismiss, the deeper they sank into the wave of outrage. A new spokesperson was brought in to give interviews, trying to downplay the situation by saying, "We just want to remind the public that this case deserves serious attention and shouldn't rely on an edited video." But that statement was quickly refuted, as numerous lawyers confirmed the footage was authentic and unaltered. In their small home, Jalen and his mother only caught bits of the news. The woman feared the backlash might harm her son, but when she saw the internet flooded with messages defending him, her eyes welled up. Jalen remained calm, as always, and quietly said, "If they're afraid of the truth, then the truth must be powerful." That short, steady sentence made his mother realize even more deeply that Jalen was growing up in a way no one could stop. The Stop Police Abuse movement kept spreading, reaching beyond the city and into neighboring states. Peaceful marches were organized, where people carried signs with Jalen's image, beneath the words, "Truth doesn't need aid." Outrage had turned into action, and that action was now propelling the story far beyond anything anyone had predicted. In the stifling atmosphere, it was clear that a fiercer confrontation was coming. The police department could not stay silent, but every time they spoke, they only fueled the resistance further. And at the center of the storm, Jalen Brooks, the 8-year-old with bright eyes and a bold voice, had become an unexpected symbol, shaking the foundations of power with nothing more than the simple truth he dared to speak. After public debate in the media reached its peak, a swarm of reporters suddenly appeared outside the small Brooks family home. Cars lined the street, cameras pointed directly at the old wooden door, turning the once quiet atmosphere into chaos, like a siege. Jalen sat inside, listening to the noise, his bright eyes calm and unshaken. He had known this moment would come, just not so soon. His mother, worried, held his hand tightly, but in the end, she let him step outside, knowing her son was strong enough to face it. On the porch, sunlight poured down on dozens of microphones pushed close, while questions flew like heavy rain. Reporters crowded in, all trying to get the first word from the 8-year-old boy the whole country was talking about. A middle-aged man with graying hair bent just low enough to meet Jalen at eye level and asked the question everyone was waiting to hear. "Where did you learn the law?" The moment the question left his mouth, the crowd fell silent. They wanted to hear the answer directly from the boy. No experts, no speculation. Jalen lifted his head, his clear eyes steady. His voice rang out strong and smooth. "My grandpa left books. I just read them to protect my mom." The answer struck like an arrow to the heart. It wasn't grand, it wasn't rehearsed. It was pure truth, born from love and a sense of duty. That simplicity hit harder than any speech, and for a moment, no microphones moved closer. A young female reporter stood still for a few seconds, lowering her pen slowly, her eyes shimmering. She hadn't expected a philosophical answer, but what Jalen said went far beyond that. After a short silence, the crowd suddenly erupted, cameras flashing, voices buzzing, people reacting. On social media, his words spread instantly, shared hundreds of thousands of times. "My grandpa left books. I just read them to protect my mom." That single sentence painted the image of a boy sitting at a worn wooden table, a heavy book in front of him, a dim yellow light shining down. His eyes focused on every word. It captured quiet persistence, fueled by one reason alone: to protect the mother who had always protected him. That motivation gave him power. The justice Jalen was fighting for didn't come from ambition or authority. It came from family and the belief that truth must be spoken. The reporters kept asking questions, but no one tried to twist or pressure anymore. They just wanted to listen, to capture the clarity in his voice. Jalen didn't speak much. He answered plainly, with calmness, as if everything he had done was the most natural thing in the world. But it was that quiet normalcy that stunned the public, because it forced the grown-ups to ask themselves, why could a child speak the truth when so many adults still stayed silent? That very afternoon, major television networks simultaneously aired footage of Jalen speaking to the press. The video quickly climbed to the top of the most-watched list. People spoke of the boy not just as a symbol of intelligence, but as a reflection of deep family love. Many newspapers wrote, "What makes Jalen special isn't his knowledge of the law, but the reason he learned it, to protect his mother." That sentiment moved millions, and the clip was shared not just for debate, but as a reminder of the strength in simple love. A new wave rose in the community. Many adults admitted they had once underestimated children's intelligence, but Jalen made them realize the value of listening. Teachers brought Jalen's story into classrooms, telling students that determination and love can overcome any prejudice. Parents read his answer to their children, teaching that knowledge is not for showing off, but for defending what matters most. That night, in the small room, Jalen sat quietly, looking out the window where the streetlight spilled in. He didn't care about cameras, headlines, or praise. In his heart, there was only one thought: how to make sure his mother was no longer dismissed. How to keep the truth from being buried. That was the only thing keeping this 8-year-old boy standing firm in the storm, and the very thing that helped millions see in him a reflection of the faith they had lost. Jalen's simple answer had already spread rapidly, but when he added one more sentence, the entire community truly erupted. Surrounded by reporters, someone asked if he thought he was doing the job of grown-up lawyers. Jalen looked straight into the camera, his eyes steady, and replied, "If a child can see justice, why can't adults?" That sentence landed like a bomb in public discourse. It wasn't an excuse or a deflection. It was a direct challenge to a system shrouded in bias and silence. In that moment, every camera caught the image of an 8-year-old delivering a message that stunned not only the crowd present, but millions watching afterward. Within hours, the quote was printed in bold on front pages, shared hundreds of thousands of times on social media, and quickly became a rallying cry. The words were written on cardboard signs at peaceful protests, printed as posters hung in schools, even spray-painted on the walls of an old neighborhood. People saw in it a question that could not be denied, a blade twisting into the collective shame. Adults had grown used to looking down, while a child dared to look straight ahead. Television commentary programs simultaneously launched in-depth segments. Experts sat before the camera, offering their view that Jalen wasn't simply pointing out injustice toward his mother, but exposing society's deliberate blindness. A prominent commentator said, "Jalen's question wasn't for the court or the police. It was for all of us." Millions of viewers nodded silently, feeling personally called out by every word. Online, a new trend took off. Users changed their profile pictures to an image of Jalen, with the caption, "If a child can see justice, why can't adults?" Many parents shared the moment with their children, saying it proved that you don't need to be grown up to tell right from wrong. Teachers brought the quote into their lesson, turning it into a class discussion topic. Law students used it to begin their essays, treating it as a reminder that knowledge and truth must be paired with courage. Soon after, a prominent magazine focused on society and justice chose to put Jalen on the cover of its latest issue. The photo captured the moment he stood among reporters, his eyes sharp, his small face resolute. Next to the bold headline, "A child who sees justice." The choice sent shockwaves, as it's rare for a child to become the face of a social movement. The print edition sold out in a day, while the digital version broke the magazine's traffic record. That image showed up in bookstores, on newsstands, and became a topic of conversation at morning cafes. People pointed at the boy's face and talked, some moved to tears, others nodding as if rediscovering lost faith. No matter which side they had taken at the start of the controversy, most could no longer deny one truth. Jalen Brooks had stepped beyond the role of a child in a courtroom and become a symbol tied to a question, forcing society to confront itself. In the small house, Jalen maintained his usual rhythm, calmly watching the noisy world unfold outside. But for millions, his magazine cover and the quote that ignited the public remained etched in memory, a lasting reminder. Justice doesn't belong to age or power. It belongs only to those who dare to look directly and speak the truth. The impact of Jalen's words and image didn't stop at news sites or social media. It began to seep into academic life and the legal community. A group of law students at a prestigious university quickly organized a public screening of the clip in a large lecture hall. Hundreds of students packed into the space normally reserved for academic seminars. But this time, the atmosphere was different, both electric and solemn. When the large screen lit up and the image of the 8-year-old boy standing tall, speaking clearly, with unwavering eyes filled the hall, the entire crowd fell silent. It was not an awkward silence, but a shared understanding that they were witnessing something more important than any lecture. After the clip ended, students broke into excited discussion, and many visibly moved. One exclaimed that the boy had voiced what they had long thought, but never dared to say in class or mock trial. Another group debated that the most valuable lesson wasn't about legal knowledge, but how Jalen saw through the core of the issue and refused to accept dishonesty. The discussion turned into an impromptu class, where each student took away a personal lesson about the kind of lawyer they wanted to become. The influence spread so widely that an association of veteran judges felt compelled to speak out. In a closed-door meeting that leaked to the press, several judges expressed astonishment at Jalen's observation and reasoning skill. A retired judge, once known for his strict standards with young attorneys, remarked in a brief interview, "That child understands the law better than many officers." The comment quickly made headlines on major news sites, thrilling the public. It wasn't just praise for Jalen, it was a direct blow to those who had mocked him in court. These remarks continued to circulate, turning the event from a single trial into a broad public dialogue about justice, responsibility, and the ethics of those in power. Other law schools followed suit, organizing forums and using Jalen's clip as a starting point for debate practice. Some professors admitted they'd never had such a vivid and persuasive example to help students grasp that justice can come from anyone, anywhere. In the wider community, Jalen's words continued to fuel everyday conversation. People brought up the story at family dinners, at work, in coffee shops, and even in town hall meetings. Many parents retold it to their children, teaching them that nothing is too small when you're standing for the truth. The image of an 8-year-old boy standing tall in a courtroom had moved beyond legal context, becoming a symbol that inspired courage. For those who had once felt disillusioned by the system, seeing a child dare to question abusers of power brought renewed faith. It made them ask themselves, if a boy could see and speak the truth, what reason did adults have to stay silent? The spread of this moment didn't just shake the image of the local police, it opened a larger societal reckoning about transparency and justice. In a live television panel, another veteran judge spoke, his voice hoarse with age, firm. "I've presided over thousands of cases, but I've never seen a child deliver such sharp words. If we don't reflect on ourselves, what will justice mean to the next generation?" His words touched a common fear, turning into a question that haunted millions. The Jalen Brooks event didn't just spark a media storm, it opened the door to a broader movement, where people discussed justice, responsibility, and courage without pause. And in all those conversations, Jalen's image was no longer that of an 8-year-old boy, but the embodiment of a simple truth. Justice is always visible if we are brave enough to face it. Jalen's impact didn't stop at law schools or judges' commentary. It reached numerous human rights organizations that had long tracked abuses in the legal system. As the clip was carefully analyzed and the boy's words echoed everywhere, many organizations issued statements. They didn't just praise Jalen as a phenomenon, they emphasized that this story highlighted a deep flaw. Children are often dismissed in legal proceedings and denied a voice. One international group based in New York even hosted a virtual forum titled "The Voice of Children in Justice." Using this very case as a central example, They invited lawyers, sociologists, and parents who had faced injustice, all coming together to examine why Jalen's courage struck such a powerful chord. From those discussions, a movement to protect children's legal rights began to take shape. At first, it was just online posts, but within days, it became a full-fledged campaign. New slogans spread quickly. Listen to children's voices. Justice belongs to childhood too. Children deserve respect in court. These messages soon appeared on banners in small protests across cities. In one central square, hundreds gathered, raising images of Jalen alongside calls for legal reform to better protect children in court. Many non-governmental organizations seized the opportunity to accelerate long-standing projects, now receiving wide attention thanks to the momentum of the case. They submitted petitions to Congress, demanding specific regulations to ensure that in any trial involving children, there must be mechanisms in place to seriously protect and hear them. Some well-known lawyers volunteered to join the campaign, pledging to represent children for free in cases that showed signs of abuse of power. The international community quickly joined in. Major news outlets in Europe and Asia reported on Jalen, portraying him as a new symbol of the global human rights movement. As a result, many child-focused organizations in other countries began to respond in unison. One group in the United Kingdom launched a campaign called Children See Justice Too, calling for millions of signatures to pressure governments into strengthening child protection measures in legal proceedings. Another organization in South Africa used Jalen's image to illustrate an article about the importance of early legal education for children. The rising energy soon spread into a wide-reaching movement. In schools, teachers began dedicating time for students to discuss their rights, no longer treating them as distant theoretical lessons. On social media, millions of shares transformed Jalen's story into a catalyst for unity. Families who had previously paid little attention to politics began discussing how to ensure their children were not dismissed when facing the legal system. In a nationally televised forum, many representatives from human rights organizations sat together, affirming that the time had come to change how society perceives the voices of children. One female lawyer said, "Jalen has shown us that children can see the truth more clearly than many adults. The only thing missing is a system willing to listen." The studio audience responded with prolonged applause, while thousands of comments online expressed strong agreement. The movement to protect children's rights in the justice system was no longer just a slogan. It had become real action. Volunteer groups set up hotlines for children and families to report injustices. Speaking events were organized, bringing experts into schools to teach students about their basic civil rights. And all of these steps traced back to the image of an 8-year-old boy standing in a courtroom, speaking the truth with clarity, sparking a wave of change no one could stop. As the wave of public opinion grew stronger, with calls for justice for Jalen and his mother echoing across forums, a group of independent lawyers decided they could no longer remain silent. They had followed the story from the beginning, witnessed the 8-year-old boy standing in court, boldly pointing out the flaws in the prosecution's case. To them, this was no longer an ordinary trial, but a wake-up call for the entire system. So, they formed a task force and began re-examining the very files that prosecutors had once labeled as irrefutable evidence. Within just a few days, irregularities began to surface. The lawyers scrutinized each record, cross-checked dates against administrative documents, and compared signatures to original samples stored in other files. What they found were not just inconsistencies, blatant errors, like a statement dated before Jalen's mother had even arrived at the police station, or a signature that looked nothing like her familiar handwriting. These were not simple mistakes. They pointed to a more troubling possibility. Someone had deliberately fabricated evidence. In parallel with document analysis, the legal team also reinvestigated the arrest procedure. They tracked down internal reports, spoke with outside witnesses, questioned neighbors, and even the night shift staff who were on duty the evening the incident occurred. Piece by piece, a different picture emerged, one that clashed entirely with what the prosecution had presented in court. It became clear that Officers Turner and Miller had violated protocol by making an arrest without a warrant, then retroactively filled in the paperwork to legitimize it. This was not a technical error, but an intentional act to trap an innocent person. When these findings were quietly shared within legal circles, the reaction was immediate and intense. Veteran legal experts expressed outrage, declaring that forging evidence destroyed the very foundation of justice and dragged public trust into darkness. One of the lawyers in the group said during a press conference, "If an 8-year-old boy could see through the lies, then we have an even greater duty to expose the truth." His statement resonated powerfully, moving many viewers who watched it live. The public response quickly escalated into a full-blown wave. People shared articles about the new investigation with fury and determination. retaliation. They didn't just want the truth, they wanted those who abused their authority to face consequences. Heated discussions erupted everywhere, from cafes to political forums, all circling around one point. The system had allowed dishonesty to go unchecked for too long, and now the truth had to be brought into the light. The team of lawyers pressed forward with urgency. They compiled a detailed report, submitting it to the higher courts and internal oversight bodies. In it, they outlined each altered piece of evidence, every skipped procedure, along with irrefutable comparisons. The pages were dense with printed text, but the language was sharp and forceful, heavy enough to hang like a weight over the heads of the officers who once mocked Jalen. Inside their small home, Jalen heard the news about the new investigation. His mother went quiet, her eyes welling up as she realized that finally, there were adults willing to stand up, not just for them, but for true justice. Jalen didn't say much, only nodded slightly, his eyes reflecting a quiet belief that truth would prevail. For him, it wasn't a surprise, but something inevitable. Once the lies had been exposed by a child, the adults could no longer stay silent. These findings didn't just shift the course of the case, they marked a turning point. For the first time in years, there was a powerful sense of unity between the public and the legal community in exposing misconduct by the police. From that moment on, the fight for justice was no longer Jalen Brooks's solitary journey. It became a shared mission for an entire community that believed truth could not be buried. The independent legal team's report, sent directly to the court and released publicly, caused an unprecedented shock. Every line confirmed that the entire arrest process of Jalen's mother had been flawed. From the initial testimony to the fabricated evidence, everything showed signs of being manipulated. Records considered key to the prosecution didn't match timestamps, witnesses were excluded, and even the arrest warrant hadn't been properly signed. When all these pieces came together, the final conclusion rang out like a bell of liberation. Jalen's mother was completely innocent, dragged into a legal battle through deceit and procedural tricks. When this information was announced publicly, the courtroom erupted. Some stood and clapped, others cried, overwhelmed by the sense that justice had finally broken through. Jalen's mother sat quietly in the defendant's seat, her thin hands clasped tightly, tears flowing freely. She had prepared for the worst, imagined being shamed and wrongly convicted, but in this moment, the weight of fear and humiliation vanished. She turned to her son, her tearful eyes filled with pride, knowing that it was her 8-year-old boy who had opened the path to truth. That atmosphere stood in stark contrast to the look on Prosecutor Keen's face. The woman who once stood in court with commanding authority now appeared pale. As the falsified evidence came to light, Keen nervously flipped through the files, her eyes avoiding contact with the judge or the jury. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her hands trembled slightly as she tried to rearrange documents that no longer held weight. Every argument she had prepared now rang hollow, because the truth had become undeniable. Keen's discomfort didn't go unnoticed. The jury watched closely, seeing the flicker of fear on a face once known for its arrogance. Judge Clark sat upright, his gaze sharper than ever, as if to remind everyone that the courtroom was no place for manipulation. In that moment, Prosecutor Keen no longer held the power to accuse. She had become a symbol of a system shaken to its core. Jalen sat beside his mother, his eyes fixed on Keen's face. He didn't need to say anything more, because everything that needed proving had already been revealed. But in his silence, there was a power that everyone in the courtroom could feel. It was the unwavering presence of this child that had made the adults stop and reconsider. With each passing minute, justice no longer rested in the hands of those in power. It was being redefined by intellect and courage. When Keen tried to speak, her voice was hoarse, missing its usual firmness. She spoke of technical errors and unfortunate misunderstanding, but even she knew those excuses could no longer calm public anger or mislead the jury. The slight tremble at the corner of her lips betrayed everything, and that fear made many in the courtroom feel that the scales of justice were finally beginning to balance. The conclusion that Jalen's mother was innocent did more than clear one person's name. It exposed a painful truth. There are those willing to use power to trap the vulnerable, but there are also quiet voices brave enough to tear down walls of lies. And on that day, the injustice carried by one woman was lifted, while those who once felt untouchable began to fear the approach of truth. The atmosphere in the courtroom turned heavy after the independent investigation confirmed Jalen's mother was innocent, and all eyes shifted toward the prosecution and the police. Jalen sat quietly, his small hands resting on his knees, but his eyes never wavered. While Prosecutor Keen still fumbled through disorganized files, the boy suddenly stood up, his voice echoing through the silent room. The statement was coerced. The courtroom stirred. Some whispered. Others turned to each other in disbelief that an 8-year-old could say aloud what many adults had never dared to. Jalen stepped forward, his hand pointing at the statement transcript lying before Judge Clark. He spoke clearly, his voice slow but sharp. "The record says my mom signed the document right after being arrested, but there was no lawyer present. That violates her right to counsel. And if she was threatened, the statement isn't valid." Each word hit like a blow to those involved. This was no coincidence, but a logical breakdown of facts from a child's mind that struck at the heart of the issue. Judge Clark leaned slightly forward, his hand pausing over the wooden gavel. He looked straight at the boy, then shifted his gaze toward Turner and Miller. His voice rang out sternly. "Officers, the court demands an immediate answer regarding the circumstances of the statement. Was it obtained under coercion?" The cold precision of the question cut through the silence like a blade. Turner frowned, inhaled sharply, and tried to maintain composure. He glanced at Miller for support, but Miller avoided his eyes, face flushing red. Under dozens of watching eyes, Turner stammered, "We followed proper procedure." The weak defense was met with murmurs of discontent from the audience. A juror shook their head slightly, clearly unconvinced. Jalen didn't wait for the truth to be buried. He stepped forward again, his dark eyes shining, voice louder now. "If it really followed procedure, then why isn't there a supervising lawyer's signature on the record? Why doesn't the time of the statement match the time of the arrest? The court can check. It's all wrong." The 8-year-old spoke as if he had handled dozens of cases, his voice firm and full of force. His questions left Turner speechless, unable to respond. Judge Clark slammed the gavel hard, his cold gaze sweeping the prosecution table. "The court demands a clear answer, not evasion," he said firmly. Keene lowered her head, her hands squeezing the documents so tightly they crumpled, yet she couldn't say a word. Miller finally spoke, voice trembling. "We just wanted the case resolved quickly." The half-admission was like a match thrown into a barrel of gunpowder. The courtroom erupted in shouts. Jurors exchanged furious looks, and Clark furrowed his brow, striking the gavel repeatedly to restore order. In that chaotic moment, the image of Jalen, standing small before the bench, stood out more than ever. He showed no fear, did not back down, only looked straight ahead, and repeated, "A coerced statement is not the truth. Justice cannot rely on lies." His words rang out like a declaration, shaking the entire room. Clark sighed, but there was a shift in his gaze. He no longer looked at Jalen as a disruptive child, but as a voice speaking for the truth. The trial, which had previously tilted in favor of the prosecution, had now completely reversed course. The mockery, the smug grins from Turner and Miller were gone, replaced by unease, while Jalen became the center of an unintentional respect. That moment not only brought silence to the courtroom but also sent out a clear message. Once spoken, the truth shakes every lie. And it was Jalen Brooks, through his courage, who turned the tide, steering the trial in a direction no one had foreseen. After Judge Clark demanded a clear answer regarding the interrogation process, all eyes shifted toward Turner and Miller. The two officers, once arrogant, are now visibly uneasy. Turner adjusted his tie, eyes drifting toward the table, as if searching for the right words among the wood grain. Miller pressed his lips together, his face flushed red, eyes blinking rapidly, but avoiding both the judge and the jury. Their silence spoke louder than any defense. They confirmed that what Jalen had said was not fiction, but truth being suppressed. Turner stammered a few empty words. Miller nodded faintly in support, but neither could form a coherent response. The jury did not miss their discomfort. Seated in a row, faces once stern now began to shift. Some whispered to each other, and the salt-and-pepper-haired man in the front leaned toward his neighbor and muttered, "They're clearly afraid to face this." The woman beside him nodded, her gaze sharp as a blade. One by one, eyes turned toward the officers, no longer neutral, but judging. The mood in the courtroom shifted swiftly, a wave of discontent spreading, making the silence feel even heavier. Judge Clark continued to watch, his fingers tapping the gavel slowly. He didn't need to push for more because Turner and Miller's expressions had already exposed the truth. The jury began exchanging glances, furrowed brows and quiet sighs, clearly showing they no longer believed in the prosecution's version. Jalen observed everything, his eyes glowing, though his face remained calm. He knew the truth was slowly leaning in his and his mother's favor, and he didn't need to shout. Steadfastness was enough. A cough came from the back, followed by growing murmurs. The audience could no longer hold their patience, having seen enough to know which way the scales of justice were tipping. "They're dodging the truth," said a voice softly, but it spread quickly, followed by murmurs of agreement. The public's outrage, once outside, had now seeped into the very room once considered solemn. Under mounting pressure, Turner lowered his head, both hands clenched tightly until pale, while Miller looked up at the ceiling as if searching for an invisible escape. But every eye in the room was locked on them, allowing no way out. In the sharp gaze of the jury, the two officers were no longer representatives of the law, but defendants judged by their silence and evasion. The courtroom slowly quieted, but the tension remained suffocating. Everyone understood one thing: the truth had crossed a threshold where it could no longer be hidden. Jalen sat down, his small hands neatly folded on the table, eyes still fixed on the two officers. He didn't need to say anything more, because their silence spoke for him. And in that moment, the jury had made an unspoken decision. Justice could not stand with those who avoided the truth. It belonged to those who faced it. As the trial continued to revolve around Turner and Miller's growing discomfort, an unexpected event shook the city once again. A nearly 3-minute video began circulating online, allegedly recorded secretly by a court staff member. It didn't show Jalen's rebuttals or his exposure of flawed evidence, but instead captured the moment when the officers mocked him right inside the courtroom, just before the judge called for order. Turner's voice was clearly heard sneering, "Bringing toys to court, huh?" Followed by Miller's loud laughter and condescending glances. What was once a whispered rumor now appeared vividly before millions of eyes. Within hours, the clip appeared on nearly every social media platform. Major news outlets ran headlines like, "Video shows police mocking 8-year-old in court." Viewers were stunned and outraged, not only by the abuse of power through fabricated evidence, but also by the blatant disrespect shown to a child trying to defend his mother. Comments flooded in, many repeating the same sentence: "They didn't just abuse power, they insulted a child." That phrase quickly turned into a new rallying cry, repeated like a public indictment against those who had disregarded the dignity of the vulnerable. The incident escalated public outrage to an entirely new level. While some had previously debated whether Jalen was truly gifted or merely repeating what he had memorized, that question quickly faded. The issue was no longer about the boy's intellect, but about the character of the officers entrusted to uphold justice. People were furious because they saw their own children in Jalen, and the fact that he was mocked in a place meant to uphold justice struck at the pride of an entire society. The national evening news replayed the video, with the anchor looking directly into the camera and stating firmly, "The police didn't just fail to maintain order, they became the source of disgrace. And the one they mocked was a child." Those words struck another blow to an already enraged public. In cafes, on sidewalks, in office buildings, the incident became the main topic of conversation. Many shook their heads in disbelief that such shamelessness had taken place. At City Hall, social advocacy groups gathered outside with signs that read, "Respect children, respect justice." Human rights organizations immediately issued a joint statement demanding an independent investigation into Turner and Miller's conduct and attitude. A group of parents submitted an open letter to the authority, stressing that this incident was not merely a procedural mistake, but a glaring example of the moral decay within the law enforcement system. Inside the small house, Jalen's mother sat frozen as she rewatched the video. She had grown used to being disregarded, but seeing her son mocked like a joke made her chest tighten. Jalen sat beside her, his face calm, but his eyes glinted with resolve. He didn't need to say anything, because the video itself had confirmed what he had sensed throughout the trial. Justice cannot be upheld by those who lack respect for it. Piece by piece, the truth continued to emerge, with no way left to conceal it. If the initial public outcry had been sparked by Jalen's intellect, now it was fueled by raw evidence exposing those who had ridiculed him. And when public trust is bound together by both reason and emotion, no force can stop the rising tide demanding that justice be fully carried out. After the video of the police mocking Jalen leaked and ignited public outrage, the pressure quickly forced the top levels of the justice system to act. Within 2 days, the Federal Judicial Council officially announced an independent investigation focused on the conduct of officers Turner and Miller, as well as Prosecutor Keene's handling of the case. The announcement was delivered on national television with a firm tone, declaring that no one, not even those in law enforcement, has the right to violate human dignity, especially when the target is a child. That statement rang out like a warning bell, signaling that nothing could return to how it once was. The investigation didn't stop at a narrow scope, but but expanded to include the entire local police department. Old case files were reopened, and controversial rulings were scheduled for review. The media reported constantly on past misconduct being re-examined under new scrutiny. Step by step, the public watched as a long-protected system began to crack. Closed hearings were held, new witnesses were called, and independent experts were granted access to internal documents. The Judicial Council appeared determined, seeking to reclaim credibility by proving they were not aligned with those who abused power. Meanwhile, in society at large, the image of the local police crumbled. Citizens who had once reluctantly trusted the justice system now turned away completely. In conversations along city streets, contempt filled the air. People recalled the video with fury. They didn't just abuse power, they treated a child like a joke. Posters calling for police reform appeared in storefronts, while schools held small forums for students to discuss the responsibilities of those who wear the uniform. Young officers in the force also began to feel the consequences. On the streets, they were met with cold stares and even sarcastic remarks. Online, thousands of comments echoed the same message. Trust in the local police was gone, and rebuilding that trust would be impossible without deep, structural change. A few retired veterans appeared on television, their voices heavy. "We destroyed our own image. No enemy ever did that. Only those who forgot their duty." The collapse of credibility didn't happen overnight, but that video became the final drop that made the glass overflow. It rendered all attempts at cover-up meaningless. People no longer wanted explanations or half-hearted apologies. They wanted real action. And with the independent investigation launched by the Judicial Council, the door to truth was now open wider than ever. Jalen remained in the small house with his mother, but from afar, he could feel the ripple effects he had unknowingly set in motion. He didn't care how people celebrated him. All that mattered was that his mother had been cleared, and those who once mocked them were now facing real justice. To the public, the image of that 8-year-old child had become more than a symbol of bravery. It was a reminder that justice can rise from the most unexpected places. From that cramped courtroom, the truth had spread like wildfire, burning down the reputation of the local police. And the Judicial Council's independent investigation had now become the first step in a new chapter, where justice was no longer an empty promise, but something that had to be proven through action and transparency. When the independent investigation by the Judicial Council officially concluded that the entire case had been built on procedural violations and fabricated evidence, the court had no choice but to make a definitive decision. That morning, the courtroom was packed, not only with lawyers and journalists, but also with curious citizens eager to witness the end of a long period of injustice. Prosecutor Keene appeared with a tired face, no longer carrying her usual confidence. She stood at the wooden podium, her voice hoarse, each word catching in her throat. "I apologize to the Brooks family. The errors in the legal process caused them unnecessary suffering." The words echoed through the room, revealing her reluctance, yet marking the collapse of her credibility. The eyes fixed on Keene were far from forgiving. Some people shook their head, others watched in silence, knowing this was the consequence she had to face now that the truth had come to light. Jalen sat beside his mother, eyes wide open, listening to every word from the woman who had tried repeatedly to make him a laughingstock. He said nothing, but placed his small hand on his mother's, squeezing it tightly, as if to remind her that what mattered wasn't Keene's humiliation, but that justice had finally been restored. His mother bowed her head, tears spilling out, partly from the pain that had built up for so long, and partly from the relief of hearing a public apology spoken aloud in court. After the apology, Judge Raymond Clark sat upright in his high-backed chair, his face stern. He struck the gavel 3 times, the sound ringing throughout the chamber. His voice followed, firm and clear. "This court hereby dismisses all charges against Mrs. Brooks. The case is officially closed." That declaration was like a blade cutting through all deceit, and at the same time, a bell ringing to affirm that truth had prevailed. A wave of sighs swept through the room. Some people stood and clapped. Others were visibly moved by the rare sight of a poor black woman being vindicated by the intelligence and courage of her 8-year-old son. Clark no longer looked at Jalen with the same disdain as he had in the early days. He paused for a moment, letting his gaze rest on the boy, a silent acknowledgement. He didn't need to say anything more. But the stillness spoke volume. The judge had changed his perspective. Once viewing Jalen as a disruptive child, he now saw him as a voice that had forced the system to confront itself. Outside the courthouse, the crowd of reporters and citizens erupted when they heard the charges had been dropped. Signs reading "Justice for Brooks" were held high. cheers mixed with applause, creating a scene unlike any other. On live television, the footage of Keene bowing her head in apology and Clark declaring the case dismissed replayed over and over, becoming a symbol of a turning point in the fight for justice. For the Brooks family, that moment was not just a release, but a confirmation that the suffering they had endured was not in vain. Jalen's mother pulled him into her arm, whispering words of thanks through tears. Jalen looked up, eyes clear and bright, not with arrogance, but with the calm gaze of a boy who had simply done what needed to be done. He wasn't seeking praise, but it was precisely that humility that made his story a source of hope for millions. That day, justice came not only through the dismissal of charges, but through a public apology spoken aloud before hundreds of people. It stood as proof that power can be shaken, lies can fall apart, and truth, even when it comes from the clear voice of a child, is strong enough to make a system bow its head. After Judge Clark announced the dismissal of all charges, the next piece of news stunned the courtroom even more. That very afternoon, the police disciplinary board issued an official statement. Turner and Miller were suspended indefinitely pending investigation. The brief wording carried the weight of a hammer, ending the days they had stood confidently before the public with scornful eyes. When the spokesperson read the announcement, the room stirred, and many applauded as if finally releasing a long-held frustration. On social media, the suspension news shot to the top of trending searches, with thousands of comments unleashing anger toward the two officers who had openly mocked Jalen in court. Turner exited the courtroom with a hardened expression, the confidence once etched into his face now replaced with tension. Cameras zoomed in on his clenched jaw, but this time there was no applause. Miller followed behind, avoiding eye contact, trying to slip past the crowd of reporters. The image of two uniformed men who once looked down on a child, now being questioned by all of society, replayed endlessly on TV as proof of the collapse of a hollow shell of authority. Outside the courthouse, people shouted, some yelling, "Justice is coming for you!" There was no sympathy, because their actions had shattered what little trust remained in the hearts of the community. Meanwhile, inside the courtroom, Jalen still sat quietly beside his mother. The chaos outside did not disturb the calmness on his face. He didn't cheer, didn't wave, didn't seek the gaze of reporters. He simply stayed still, his small hand holding his mother's, while his eyes shone bright, radiating a quiet pride. Pride not in winning a battle, but in protecting his mother and forcing grown men to bow before the truth. Those eyes made it clear to anyone watching. Justice, even when spoken by a child, holds the power to shake the foundations of an entire system. Jalen's mother squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her cheeks as a smile formed on her lips. She knew this journey had been painful, but this moment proved it had all been worth it. The 8-year-old boy she once feared would be buried under prejudice had now become a beacon, not just for her family, but for people watching the case everywhere. Jalen's silence, in contrast to the noise outside, made his presence all the more powerful. The entire courtroom now looked at Jalen with eyes completely different from that first day. When Turner once mocked him for bringing toys to court, they had laughed, but today no one dared to underestimate him. Some members of the jury nodded slightly, as if offering a quiet recognition. Judge Clark, after striking the gavel to end the session, lingered for a moment, his gaze fixed on the boy, eyes full of reflection. In that look, there seemed to be both regret for past assumptions and respect for a child who dared to stand tall. Outside, news headlines flashed on screens non-stop. Turner and Miller suspended. Justice leans toward 8-year-old boy. But inside that small courtroom, Jalen needed no sensational banners. For him, sitting beside his mother, hand in hand, on a day when truth had prevailed, was the greatest reward. The proud look in that 8-year-old's eyes became the final image etched into everyone's memory, a reminder that justice is not a distant idea. It lives the moment an innocent heart dares to speak the truth. After weeks of investigation and evidence gathered from the exposed misconduct, a new trial was held, this time no longer focused on Jalen's mother, but aimed directly at Turner and Miller. Both appeared with hollowed faces, no longer carrying the arrogance that once filled the courtroom with tension. The courthouse lawn was packed with people, all eager to witness the moment when the men who once mocked a child would finally face justice. The indictment was read aloud, clearly stating that Turner and Miller had deliberately violated procedure, fabricated reports, and twisted the law to legitimize an unlawful arrest. Each word landed like a hammer blow, making the two officers lower their heads and avoid the public's gaze. During arguments, the prosecution had little to prove. Evidence spoke louder than any plea. Leaked video clips, the independent legal team's findings, and witness testimonies all pointed to a systemized lie. The jury's attorney emphasized that this wasn't a simple mistake but a deliberate act, leading to severe consequences when an innocent woman nearly suffered a wrongful conviction. If not for the courage of a child, the truth would have been buried, he said, drawing silence across the courtroom. When Turner was asked to speak, his voice was hoarse, offering an excuse about job-related pressure, but no one was moved, knowing he had laughed at Jalen inside the courtroom. Miller tried to shift blame onto orders from above, but each time he spoke, he was met with skeptical stares from the jury. No one in the audience believed their remorse was real. All they saw were two men struggling to stay afloat in a flood of truth. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous decision. The four persons stood and declared clearly, "We find Turner and Miller guilty of procedural misconduct and abuse of power in the execution of their duties." The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers. Many couldn't hide their emotion. They had waited too long for this moment. The sight of two once proud officers now forced to stand trial became a vivid reminder that no one stands above the law. Judge Clark delivered the final sentence, his voice firm and unwavering. "This court applies the maximum penalty to ensure justice cannot be twisted by anyone." He sentenced Turner and Miller to years in prison and permanently stripped them of their right to serve in law enforcement. The severity of the sentence left no doubt. This was a warning to the entire system. Inside the courtroom, Jalen sat quietly beside his mother, his face calm, eyes locked on every word. He didn't celebrate or retaliate with harsh words, just watched silently as Turner and Miller were led away. In the eyes of the 8-year-old boy reflected the justice everyone had been searching for, making it clear that justice is born not from revenge, but from truth and courage. That day, the sentence for those who abused their power did not just close a case, it sent a powerful message to the entire community. The law is not a tool in the hands of those in uniform, it is a light meant to shine for all. And it was a small boy, through intelligence and courage, who helped return that light to where it belongs. When the harsh verdict was announced, applause thundered through the courtroom, then slowly faded into an unusual, solemn silence. People no longer looked at Turner or Miller, the men now handcuffed and led away, but instead turned their eyes toward Jalen. Every juror, every reporter, every person packed into the back rows stood up in unison, offering the 8-year-old boy a look of deep respect. Their eyes reflected admiration, for they knew that without Jalen, the truth would have remained buried beneath layers of forged reports and oppressive power. No cheers, no praise, only thick silence and a collective gaze that formed a wall of honor around the boy. Jalen sat there, his small shoulders dwarfed by the vast space, but his eyes burned bright like a flame. He looked up at the faces watching him, not with confusion but with a calmness beyond his years. In that moment, he was no longer a helpless child needing protection, but someone who had taught adults a lesson in courage and honesty. His mother, sitting beside him with tears in her eyes, gripped his hand tightly, her heart bursting with pride, knowing that all the pain she had endured had finally turned into dignity. The atmosphere in the courtroom seemed to lift to a higher plane. Visiting judges and attorneys there to observe sat in quiet reflection. Some wiped their eyes, not out of pity, but from the overwhelming force of the simple truth Jalen had shown. Speak it, even when everyone else remained silent. The scratching of reporters' pens and clicking of cameras filled the room, but didn't disturb the reverence. Everyone present knew they were witnessing a moment that could enter the history of the justice system, where an 8-year-old boy forced an entire institution to bow its head. Judge Clark, who had once shown doubt and condescension toward Jalen, now sat still in his high chair. He looked down at the boy for a long time, his eyes visibly unsettled, as if examining himself through the lens of that courage. After a long pause, he sighed quietly, then spoke in a slow but resonant voice. "This child has taught us a lesson." The words were plain, not grandiose, but carried a weight that made the room pause. Everyone could feel that the seasoned judge, once so confident in delivering verdicts, had just admitted to being enlightened by a child. The sound of that statement echoed, becoming the crystallized conclusion to everything that had happened. It was not just for Jalen, but a reminder to everyone present that arrogance and prejudice can blind adults, yet the truth will always find its way through the purest hearts. Some reporters immediately wrote the sentence down verbatim, and just a few hours later, it appeared on the front pages of newspapers, placed in quotation marks like a symbolic quote. The courtroom slowly settled, but the echoes lingered. People left in silence, carrying with them the image of Jalen and Clark's admission. Later conversations all revolved around a single point. Justice does not only come through signed verdicts, but also through the courage to expose falsehood. In many hearts, Jalen was no longer just an 8-year-old boy, but living proof justice still has a chance to rise again, even in places that seem cold and rigid. Outside, As the courtroom doors opened, the afternoon sunlight poured down, and Jalen and his mother stepped out into the crowd. No one pushed, no one cheered, but instead stepped back to form a quiet path. Hands clapped softly out of respect. Eyes followed with renewed belief. Jalen simply held his mother's hand, walking calmly, leaving behind a public freshly stirred by a simple yet powerful truth. That day, an 8-year-old boy made an entire courtroom rise, and a once proud judge admitted he had learned a lesson. There were no medals, no loud praise, but it was Jalen's proud gaze and calm silence that etched themselves deepest into everyone's memory, like a living declaration that justice always finds its voice, even when that voice comes from a child. After Judge Clark's admission echoed through the courtroom, public opinion was reignited with a new surge of energy. Major newspapers simultaneously published images of Jalen with bold headlines, "Kid Lawyer, the 8-year-old attorney." That name appeared everywhere, from the front pages of legal journals to social columns that rarely focused on children. People stopped referring to Jalen by his given name, and instead spoke of him using this symbolic title, one that captured intelligence, courage, and kindness. In just a short time, Kid Lawyer became a household phrase, repeated on television, radio, and across social media, embedding the image of the boy deeper into the public's consciousness. The media didn't just praise Jalen's ability to uncover the truth, they explored the story behind it, about his grandfather's old law book and the nights he spent reading it to defend his mother. They described it as a journey not orchestrated by anyone, but a natural evolution of a child forced to confront injustice. These articles touched many readers, who realized Jalen's wisdom didn't come from personal ambition, but from love for his family and a longing for justice. The combination of innocence and determination gave the nickname Kid Lawyer a lasting power, turning it into a symbol of the hope society had been craving. That influence quickly reached into the world of education. The elementary school Jalen attended organized a special ceremony in his honor, something rarely done for a child so young. The auditorium was packed with teachers, students, and parents. On stage, a large banner read, "Proud of Kid Lawyer." As Jalen stepped forward, thunderous applause erupted. Classmates cheered his name, and admiration shone in their eyes. Though still a child, Jalen remained calm, his eyes sparkling as he looked out at the familiar faces. To him, this wasn't empty praise. It was proof that what he did had inspired others his age. The school principal gave a speech, saying Jalen's actions taught everyone an important lesson. The truth knows no age. Her voice trembled slightly with emotion as she said, "An 8-year-old student made society stop and think. Other children can learn that their voices matter, and we, the adults, need to listen more." Her words brought a few seconds of silence before the room burst into extended applause. Jalen received a certificate of honor and a bouquet from his teachers. He bowed in thanks, using no flowery words, simply saying, "I did it for my mom, and because I believe justice matters." That sincerity moved the crowd even more. Many parents wiped their eyes as they listened to a boy say what so many adults had forgotten. That ceremony was not just a moment of pride for one school, proof of the power held by a small symbol. From an unnoticed student, Jalen became a source of inspiration for an entire community, forcing adults who once doubted children to reconsider. And in every gaze fixed on him, it was clear that Kid Lawyer was more than a nickname. It was a reminder that truth can rise from the purest voices, and that is what gives justice its life. After the formal celebration at school, as applause still echoed, many reporters and teachers hoped Jalen would say something grand to mark the moment. They expected him to proudly accept Kid Lawyer title or speak like a polished speaker. But Jalen stood still for a few seconds, eyes on the seat where his mother sat, then softly but clearly said, "I don't want to be a hero, I just want fairness." The short sentence pierced straight into the hearts of the audience, stripping away all the glory adults had unknowingly placed on him, leaving only one simple truth. The boy fought not for fame, but for justice for his mother and himself. The auditorium fell silent after those words. Hundreds of young students sat still, wide-eyed, as if they had just learned something far beyond their textbooks. Several teachers turned away, quietly wiping their tears. Parents in the back rows nodded gently, recognizing in Jalen's words what adults sometimes forget, that fairness is the goal, not applause. Quiet sobs rose from corners of the room. Then the entire hall erupted in waves of applause laced with emotion. Jalen's mother sat still, tears falling onto her hands, but a smile on her lips. She knew her son needed no titles, no labels of heroism. He only wanted her to no longer be looked down upon, to be free from the weight of injustice caused by those who abused power. His words made every hardship feel worth it, because in the end, Jalen had kept his innocence, refusing to be swept up in the whirl of public praise. Reporters quickly published his exact quote, and by nightfall, it had spread across every social media platform. People stopped calling Jalen by flashy nicknames and instead headlined his words, "I don't want to be a hero, I just want fairness." Thousands of shares followed, with posts reflecting a deep realization. Justice does not need dazzling symbols, only truth and courage. In the days that followed, many schools used that quote as a topic of discussion. Teachers asked students what fairness meant, and why an 8-year-old could remind adults of it. Children wrote down their own ideas of fairness on pieces of paper and stuck them along the hallway, turning their schools into spaces echoing Jalen's quiet but powerful message. Out in society, human rights forums also quoted that sentence in their speeches, as a reminder that every effort to fight injustice does not come from a desire to be a hero, but from a basic need to live in truth. The ceremony ended in a tone completely different from how it began. It started with applause and expectation, but ended with eyes filled with tears. People left the auditorium with slower steps, carrying those words in their hearts. Jalen stepped down from the stage, still holding his mother's hand, his eyes bright but calm, as if he had never seen himself as different. And it was exactly that calmness that made people admire him even more, because it showed he had already understood the most important thing. Fairness does not belong to those who want praise. It belongs to those who dare to stand up and speak the truth. After Jalen's simple words spread across headlines, public attention had barely begun to settle when a new movement emerged. This time, it wasn't initiated by any organization or social activist group, but by ordinary people following the story of the 8-year-old boy. They started using a new phrase to share their thoughts. #JusticeBoy. At first it appeared in just a few personal posts, but within a week the hashtag had spread beyond the local area, reaching multiple states, becoming a new symbol for faith and justice. People used it when reposting the Courtroom video, when quoting Jalen's word, or when telling their children that there once was a boy who dared to stand up against lies. In major cities, murals began appearing on public walls, depicting Jalen with bright eyes and the words, "Justice Boy." No one gave orders, but street artists all gravitated toward the story as a source of inspiration. These murals drew large crowds, who then shared their photos online with the hashtag. Step by step, the name Jalen Brooks was no longer just linked to a special trial, but became a symbol of one generation's longing for justice. The movement didn't stop at street art. In neighborhoods, people began hanging banners in front of their homes, on balconies, even inside stores. The message appeared everywhere, bold and direct. If a child can see it, the law must not look away. The words resonated with millions because they struck at a long-standing frustration that those in power often chose silence or avoidance, while an 8-year-old saw the truth and dared to speak it. Once the slogan appeared on every street, it was no longer a reminder aimed solely at the legal system, but a call to the entire community that truth is always present. The question is whether we have the courage to face it. In schools, teachers began hosting special sessions where students re-watched the video of Jalen speaking in court. Many children stood up afterward to share their thoughts about justice, truth, and responsibility. A 10-year-old girl said, "If Jalen could speak the truth for his mom, then we can speak up when we see something wrong in class." Her words drew applause from the entire student assembly, a sign that the Justice Boy movement wasn't just an online trend. It had taken root in the everyday lives of the next generation. At the community level, local town hall meetings started dedicating time to discussions on transparency in police and court operation. People who were once indifferent now actively participated, holding small signs with the hashtag or Jalen's quotes printed on them. They were no longer voicing vague complaints, but demanding specific changes, independent oversight, protections for witnesses, and respect for children's rights in all legal matters. Local governments, which initially tried to avoid the issue, could no longer ignore the growing strength of the movement. In more distant states, the movement kept spreading thanks to the power of social media. Independent journalists traveled from place to place, capturing images of people hanging banners in front of their homes and asking why they did so. A middle-aged man from the South told the camera, "I don't know the Brooks family, but I clearly saw the message from that boy. If a child can point out the truth, then we, the adults, have no excuse to close our eyes." That statement appeared in a news segment and quickly became a widely shared quote, adding momentum to the movement. What made this movement unique was that it wasn't extreme or violent, but peaceful and humane. It didn't encourage people to tear the system down, but reminded them that the system needed to improve, needed to open its eyes to what was happening. From government officials to everyday citizens, From lawyers to teachers, all were forced to confront the fact that public trust could only be restored if justice was carried out transparently. Jalen, at the center of this wave, remained an ordinary 8-year-old boy. He didn't take part in campaigns or give long speeches to the public, but simply went to school, read books, and occasionally gave short answers when asked. But that very silence made the movement stronger, because it showed he wasn't seeking fame, only truth. When people hung banners outside their homes, they weren't thinking of some distant hero. They were thinking of a small child brave enough to speak the truth that adults avoided. More and more people came to understand that Justice Boy was no longer just a nickname attached to Jalen, but a collective banner. And the phrase, "If a child can see it, the law must not look away," became the foundation for a community-wide self-examination. It was no longer just a slogan on the streets, but a reminder heard inside homes, classrooms, and conversations among friends. Through this shift, the community began to reshape its belief in justice, a belief simple yet powerful, rekindled by the voice of an 8-year-old boy. The impact of Jalen's story didn't stop at street movements or banners on homes. It quickly entered academic spaces. Major law schools across the United States chose to make Jalen's case an official case study in their curricula. Lecture halls that were once dry came alive as students watched footage of the trial and discussed how an 8-year-old could spot flaws in a case that many adults had overlooked. Professors didn't just analyze legal aspects, but also highlighted the social impact and professional ethic, treating it as a prime example of how justice can sometimes be upheld by the voices that seem the smallest. In a lecture hall with over 100 students, the professor paused at the moment Jalen clearly said, "coerced testimony." He asked the entire class to analyze the meaning of that statement in the context of a defendant's constitutional rights. One student stood up, voice trembling but firm. If a child can recognize that a basic right has been violated, then those who make the law have an even greater responsibility to see and protect it. The room fell silent for a few seconds before erupting in applause. Discussions like these began to spread, turning Jalen into a central figure in many conversations about transparency in legal proceeding. It wasn't only students. Many seasoned professors also admitted that this case study changed how they viewed their work. One professor shared in an academic journal, "We often teach students through landmark cases that shape the law, but Jalen's story reminds us that justice isn't only etched into precedent, it can also be awakened by innocent courage." The article was widely shared, helping to push the conversation beyond classrooms, into law enforcement agencies and community forums alike. Alongside its presence in curricula, national legal conferences also began to use Jalen as a topic of discussion. At a session in Washington, many young lawyers stood up and said they chose this profession not only to defend clients, but to uphold the principle of fairness that Jalen had brought to light. Paper after paper affirmed that a healthy society cannot exist if the voices of the vulnerable are ignored. The image of an 8-year-old boy became a source of motivation for the new generation of legal professionals to reaffirm why they entered the field. The impact didn't stop with the legal community. As Jalen's case study entered textbooks, the media found new fuel to ignite public awareness. Social affairs columns treated the story as a symbol of a revived belief in justice. A national TV network launched a special series titled "Justice Through a Child's Eyes," replaying courtroom moments of Jalen's testimony interspersed with peaceful marches carrying Justice Boy banners. Viewers were moved not by drama, but by a sense that they were being awakened from indifference. Public trust in justice, long eroded by wrongful convictions, was now being powerfully reignited. People began to believe that the system could change, so long as voices kept reminding it to. Conversations at diners, on buses, in homes grew livelier, revolving around the question, if a child can see it, do we still have an excuse not to? That belief was no longer a vague ideal, but a tangible force, compelling those in power to think twice before attempting to bury the truth. A remarkable event took place when a court in another, distant state cited Jalen's case during a hearing concerning the rights of minors. The presiding judge clearly stated, "We've been reminded that justice does not discriminate by age. A child can see what an entire system overlooks." That reference appeared in the official legal record, transforming Jalen from a media figure into a part of legal discourse. For everyday people, the most important thing wasn't lofty legal theories, but the feeling that they could once again trust a system long viewed with suspicion. When banners bearing the phrase, "If a child can see clearly, then the law must not close its eyes," were hung from balconies, they weren't just reminders for police or judges, but encouragements to neighbors and friends that the truth must always be protected. That trust gradually turned into collective strength, making communities feel less less alone in the face of injustice. At the center of all these changes, Jalen remained calm. He never claimed to be a symbol, never called himself a hero, but it was that very simplicity that made the public's faith in justice more enduring. People didn't see a distant icon. They saw a real child, one who had once sat in a courtroom and dared to speak the truth. And because of that, belief in justice, long fragile in society's heart, was reignited, stronger and more resilient than ever. When the trial ended and the Justice Boy movement continued to spread, the Brooks family's life began to change noticeably. Jalen's mother, once dismissed from her job due to the scandal and pressure from the case, was now invited back to her old position at a small office in the city center. The manager, who had previously ended her contract out of fear of trouble, called her directly to apologize and admit his mistake. For the first time in months, she walked into work with a lightness in her step, no longer lowering her head under judgmental stares, but welcomed with a new sense of respect. Former colleagues came to shake her hand, one saying, "We followed everything. You and Jalen reminded us of something valuable we had forgotten." Those words moved her, not because her job was restored, but because her dignity had been. In the small house in a neighborhood once full of judgment, the change was even more visible. Before, whenever mother and son walked by, neighbors would avoid eye contact, some whispering as if they were a burden or a disgrace. Now, those looks had changed. One afternoon, as Jalen carried groceries home, the elderly woman who lived next door opened her door and smiled warmly. "You did well. We're proud to have you in our neighborhood." The boy nodded slightly, his eyes clear and quietly confident. That small community, once cold and distant, was beginning to look at them with recognition. The local children, who used to avoid Jalen because of what they overheard their parents say about the Brooks family and the law, now invited him to play in the backyard. A classmate ran over and handed him a basketball. "You made us believe telling the truth isn't always scary." For Jalen, that was a priceless gift, because it showed he had restored faith not just among adults, but also among peers his own age. His mother watched these changes with teary eyes. She had endured long days of humiliation, endured harsh whispers and cold shoulders from her own neighbors. Now, when she stepped onto her porch, there were no more hushed insults, only morning greetings and simple check-in. A man who lived nearby, usually quiet, paused at her door to say he had hung a Justice Boy banner because Jalen made him believe justice could still be found in this society. The shift in how neighbors viewed them didn't just bring relief, it helped the family feel the true worth of truth itself. They understood that the recognition they now received had been earned through pain, through tears, and through the courage of a child. That made them cherish each new day. Dinner in their small kitchen was no longer blanketed by heavy silence, but bubbled with lively conversation. The mother asked about school. Jalen shared stories of new friends who no longer avoided him, and they both smiled, realizing the darkness that once loomed was finally starting to lift. From the community's perspective, the Brooks family was no longer seen as the problem family, but as a symbol of resilience. At neighborhood meetings, their name was mentioned as an example of how unity and trust could overcome prejudice. Jalen's mother was invited to share a few words about her experience, and she spoke simply, "We're not stronger than anyone. We just walked patiently with the truth." The small hall filled with applause, many faces lowered as if acknowledging that they had once turned their backs. For Jalen, the family's renewal didn't come from headlines or praise, but from quiet, everyday moments. He no longer had to walk through the neighborhood under suspicious eyes, but could smile and return greeting. He didn't need to prove he was smarter than anyone. He just needed to know his mother got her job back and the family's dignity was restored. He understood that fairness wasn't something distant, but something real when neighbors stopped whispering and started showing respect. The Brooks family was reborn in love and recognition. Jalen's mother had her job again, the neighborhood changed how they looked at them, and the little house became a place of renewed hope. In every steady step, Jalen knew he hadn't fought in vain. The 8-year-old didn't want to be a hero, but his quiet determination had given his family a new life, a chance to begin again in the warmth of community. After all the turbulent days, as the public attention began to fade and life returned to its normal rhythm, Jalen kept one simple habit. Every evening after dinner, he sat at his old desk and opened the worn law books. The soft yellow light from the desk lamp glowed over each page, reflecting in his focused eyes. There was no pressure from courtrooms, no judging stares from adults, only patience and a desire to understand the words his grandfather once left behind. For Jalen, reading law books wasn't about being a hero in anyone's eyes, but about better understanding the world and protecting what he believed was right. In the small room, a framed photo of his grandfather sat on a wooden shelf, the serious yet kind face watching over every turn of the page. Though long gone, The man lived on in memory, and in the words Jalen studied each night. Many times, Jalen's mother passed by and saw her son murmuring as if in conversation with him, his eyes lighting up when he discovered something new. She didn't interrupt or offer too much advice, only stood quietly behind him, smiling as her child found passion in those old, fragile pages. The nights in the neighborhood were often quiet, but the little house stayed warm. The soft sound of turning pages mixed occasionally with the breeze drifting through the window. Jalen tilted his head, lips moving as he read aloud the legal terms he hadn't fully grasped, but was determined to remember. He scribbled notes in pencil on small scraps of paper, stacking them neat. Each time he found a new law, he looked up at the photo of his grandfather, as if to show he'd taken another step on the path his grandfather once walked. In his eyes was pride, longing, and a silent promise to carry forward what had been left behind. After a long day at work, Jalen's mother often sat in the living room listening to him read soft. To her, that sound was like a lullaby, a gentle reminder that life could have taken a darker path if not for Jalen's courage. She once feared that the trial would steal her son's innocence. But as she watched him immersed in learning, she realized the opposite had happened. The hardship had made him grow, yet he still carried the pure heart of a child who wanted to understand the world. Some neighbors, curious, stopped by in the evening and were surprised to see Jalen hunched over books. An 8-year-old boy, who could have been lost in games or cartoons, instead spent hours reading dry legal texts. But when they looked into his determined eyes, they understood this wasn't forced. It was a natural passion, ignited by the example of his grandfather. One quietly said, "This child was born to walk with justice." Each time he finished a chapter, Jalen carefully closed the book, stacked it neatly on the shelf, and looked up at the familiar photo. In his mind, his grandfather's words echoed, "Learn the law to protect, not to abuse." Though too young to grasp the full meaning, Jalen felt the weight of those words and kept them as his guiding principle. In that way, his grandfather continued to teach him, even if only through memory and old books. Now and then, his mother would walk in, place a hand on his shoulder, and ask softly, "Aren't you tired?" Jalen would smile and shake his head. "I just want to understand more. So, one day, if needed, I can stand up to protect you and others." Her eyes filled with tears, not from worry, but from pride. In that moment, she saw her father, once the pride of the family, alive again in his grandson, like a flame passed through generations. In that humble room, the air was always filled with a quiet sense of peace. The photo of his grandfather, with its kind eyes, seemed to watch over him, smiling at Jalen's effort. To the boy, it was the greatest encouragement. Each time his eyes rested on the picture, he found the strength to read one more page, to jot down one more note. And in that way, night after night, his belief in justice grew, not through public praise, but through silent perseverance in the warm yellow light at his little desk. The revival of the Brooks family was not just seen in the mother's regained job or the neighbors' changed views, but in peaceful nights like these. An 8-year-old child, instead of being haunted, found hope and drive in the very events that could have broken him. He kept reading, as if continuing a long conversation with his grandfather, as if proving that justice never dies. It simply waits for someone brave enough to speak. And as the desk lamp shone down, lighting up Jalen's focused face, it became clear that the photo on the shelf was not just a memory, but a living testament to a sacred legacy between generations, where justice and love remain the guiding light. Jalen's story was no longer confined within the borders of the United States. It quickly crossed borders, spreading around the world through international media channels. Major newspapers in Europe, Asia, and Africa simultaneously published articles about the 8-year-old boy with headlines that made readers pause. 8 years old, defending justice. On the front page of a French paper, a photo of Jalen pointing at a case file in court appeared next to the caption, "Truth through a child's eyes." In Japan, television channels replayed the moment he said, "The statement was forced," leaving viewers visibly moved. In South Africa, a local newspaper emphasized that this story proved the universal value of justice, regardless of age or skin color. Everywhere, Jalen was seen through different cultural lenses, but the common thread was admiration for a child brave enough to challenge bias and abuse of power. It wasn't just the media. International organizations also took notice. UNICEF issued a statement, calling Jalen's story a clear example of why children must be given the right to speak on issues that affect their lives. Many human rights conferences included the case in their discussion, as a reminder that listening to children is not a favor but a responsibility. Legal experts from various countries wrote analyses comparing the child protection systems in the U.S. to other countries, raising the question of whether the current safeguards are truly sufficient to protect young voices. The strongest wave of influence came from children around the world. Dozens of handwritten letters and emails began arriving at Jalen's school, sent by kids his age, some from countries he had never heard of. A girl from Brazil wrote, "Jalen, I don't know the law, but you gave me the courage to believe we can speak the truth to adults." A boy in India scribbled, "I want to be like you and speak up when something is wrong." These simple messages, piled into envelopes, filled Jalen's elementary school with love and admiration. Teachers had to set up a separate room just to store and sort the letters. Many were decorated with children's doodles. Some showed Jalen standing in court, others holding a thick law book, and some were as simple as two hands held tightly with the word justice. Jalen read each letter, his eyes glowing with both surprise and emotion. He hadn't expected that what he did to protect his mother would become an inspiration for so many children around the world. His mother often sat beside him, reading aloud letters written in unfamiliar languages that had been translated, occasionally pausing to wipe away tears. International television closely followed the response. A news channel in the UK produced a special feature on The Letter Wave to Justice Boy. Images of letters stacked high, envelopes stamped from across continents were shown repeatedly, creating the sense that Jalen was no longer just a boy from one country, but had become a little friend to the entire world. Journalists remarked, "While many adults choose silence in the face of injustice, an 8-year-old child has sparked courage in the hearts of millions of others." At many schools abroad, teachers used Jalen as an example in lessons about justice and human rights. A classroom in Germany organized a group letter-writing session where each student expressed their thoughts on truth and justice, then sent them to Jalen's address. In South Korea, high school students discussed his quote, "A child sees justice, why don't adults?" and wrote it on the classroom board as their shared motto. That ripple effect made adults reflect, while children found in Jalen a relatable role model, not a distant superhero, but a real kid who dared to speak the truth. The international community responded in its own way. In France, a group of law students launched an online campaign with the slogan, "Justice is ageless," using Jalen's image as its emblem. In Canada, a child rights organization hosted a national forum, using Jalen's video to encourage kids to take part in legal conversation. Even in remote places, like a village in Kenya, children heard his story via radio, and many wrote letters by hand, asking a charity group to send them to him. For Jalen, all these reactions felt like a strange dream. He was just a child who wanted to protect his mom, but now, thousands of peers around the world were saying his name, seeing him as a source of inspiration. As he looked at the colorful envelopes covering his desk, Jalen smiled, not out of pride, but from feeling a kind of connection he had never known. In his eyes, the photo of his grandfather on the shelf seemed to appear again, nodding in agreement. Justice was no longer a concept confined by borders, but a bridge connecting pure hearts. The global reach of Jalen's story turned it into a worldwide symbol, reminding people that a true voice can come from anyone, even an 8-year-old in a small courtroom. And when children in many countries picked up pens to write to him, the world was reminded that the future of justice doesn't belong only to the powerful, but to an entire generation willing to face the truth. As his story made headlines and thousands of letters from children arrived, human rights organizations began using his courtroom clip as official material in large-scale conferences. In Geneva, at an annual summit on children's rights, the video of Jalen standing up and calling out the injustice in the courtroom was screened before hundreds of delegates. The entire hall fell silent. From legal experts and social activists to government officials, everyone quietly watched the image of an 8-year-old boy speaking firmly, pointing directly at the truth that many adults had overlooked. When the video ended, applause erupted, not because the boy was a brilliant orator, but because the sincerity of his voice had made dry debates feel vivid and real. Human rights organizations realized that Jalen's clip was not just an illustration of a specific case, but a visual symbol of the need to listen to children. Many international conferences later included a section titled "Justice Boy Case" in their agendas, using it as a special case study to discuss reforms in legal systems protecting children's rights. Experts used Jalen's image to show that children are not always passive subjects, but can become active agents of change. The mockery he endured, the details he uncovered in the file, and his calm stance before the prosecutor were all analyzed as strong evidence that justice cannot be limited by age. On international forums, the phrase, "justice is not age-bound," appeared more and more often. It was written in academic papers, repeated in speeches by activists, and gradually accepted as a widely embraced slogan. A journalist in the UK remarked, "If an 8-year-old boy can shake the system, it reminds us that justice is not the privilege of adults, but a shared human right." From Asia to Africa, international news channels opened discussion segments around this theme, questioning whether the world had truly created space for children to be heard. Many law schools abroad organized special seminars, inviting students to discuss Jalen's video. A professor in Canada told his class, What matters here isn't how much Jalen knew, but that he spoke up when everyone else stayed silent. That is the spirit of justice. His words were written down by students, shared online, and quickly became a widely circulated quote. In South America, a group of law students even launched a forum called Justice Without Aid, where they exchanged ideas and proposed initiatives to ensure children in their region also had the chance to speak up. In academic circles, many studies were inspired by Jalen. A team of scholars in Germany released a report emphasizing that justice systems around the world often view children as weak witnesses. But this case proved that weakness does not mean a lack of perception or analytical ability. The report ended with a call to action. We must see children as partners in building justice, not just as subjects to protect. The report was translated into multiple languages and circulated throughout the international legal community, further strengthening the view that justice makes no distinction in aid. Even in high-level political meetings, Jalen's image was brought up. A member of parliament in Europe, during a speech on legal system reform, directly cited, "If a child can see injustice and speak out, then we, the ones in power, have no excuse to pretend we are blind." The quote was picked up by international media, creating a strong wave of public opinion that pushed forward policies related to children and civil rights. To the public, Jalen's video became fuel for social movements around the world. In the Philippines, child rights groups organized outdoor screenings so thousands could watch the video and discuss ways to bring real change to their country. In Egypt, a regional conference used the clip in a keynote speech, bringing many parents to tears as they thought of their own children. The plain truth that Jalen pointed out became a flame, igniting the hearts of those who had long felt powerless before the machinery of authority. As for Jalen, when he heard his mother reading international articles or saw his image shown at conferences, he showed no pride. He simply gazed at the photo of his grandfather, smiled softly, then reopened his familiar law book. In the heart of that 8-year-old boy, justice wasn't tied to fame, but to simplicity. A person must dare to speak what is right, whether young or grown. That very simplicity made the whole world pause and admit that justice has no age. The impact of Jalen's clip turned a small courtroom in America into a global echo. From international summits to elementary classrooms, from politicians to school children, people agreed on one common message: truth does not depend on age, and justice only exists when every voice, no matter how small, is heard. One early autumn morning, under a clear sky and cool breeze, Jalen and his mother returned to the courthouse, the place where all the upheaval began, and also where the name of an 8-year-old boy had spread across the world. But this time, he did not walk in with fear or under scornful eyes, but as an honored guest at a special forum on justice and judicial reform. The cold stone steps that once weighed down his stride now echoed with lighter, more confident footsteps. Jalen held his mother's hand as they quietly passed through the grand entrance, warmly greeted by a large crowd in attendance. That courtroom was no longer filled with case files and sneers, but with judges, lawyers, law students, and human rights activists. Every eye followed as the small boy walked to the front row. Judge Clark, who had presided over the case that shook the public, sat in his familiar high chair, but upon seeing Jalen, he immediately stood up. The gesture stirred the entire hall, for it was rare for a seasoned judge to show such open respect. Clark gave a slight bow and said, his voice deep and sincere, "We are here today because of this boy. Jalen Brooks taught me and all of us a lesson we must never forget." The room erupted in applause, not loud cheering, but a deep acknowledgement. Jalen stood up, a bit shy, but his eyes sparkled. He needed no long speech, just spoke with his familiar, clear voice. "I didn't come here to retell old stories. I came to remind you that justice isn't something far away. It begins when someone sees the truth and dares to speak it. If a child can do that, then adults have no excuse to turn away." The simple words left many in the audience silent, for they recalled the entire journey they had witnessed, from courtroom tears to a global movement. Jalen's mother sat in the audience, eyes brimming with tears, but her face was glowing. She remembered the long days of humiliation, losing her job, living under judgmental stares, and how, thanks to her son's courage, everything had turned around. Now, the very people who once sat high above, passing judgment, stood to applaud her child. It was not just personal pride, but a testament to the power of truth. After Jalen spoke, Judge Clark stepped down from the high bench and walked directly to him. He placed a hand on Jalen's shoulder, his eyes showing an emotion rarely seen in someone long accustomed to the coldness of the law. "That day, I only saw a mischievous child making trouble. Today, I see a symbol reminding us that justice must live in each of our hearts. Thank you for waking us up." His admission echoed through the room, prompting many to rise together, as if to affirm that they too shared that very feeling. The forum continued with speeches from various experts, but the image of Jalen remained at the center, Speakers referenced his story as a cornerstone for judicial reform, with many calling it the most powerful verdict the system had ever received, not from a high court, but from the honest voice of a child. As the event neared its end, the moderator invited Jalen to share a final message. He looked around, letting his gaze pause on each face, then softly said, "I don't want to be remembered as a hero. I just hope that whenever you work, you remember that there are young eyes watching, and if we children can clearly see what's wrong, then justice must never close its eyes." That sentence brought the hall into a sacred silence before it erupted in thunderous, sustained applause. People no longer clapped just for the bravery of an 8-year-old boy, but for a truth spoken in the simplest words. Many judges, lawyers, and young law students left the hall deep in thought, as if carrying a newly lit flame in their hearts. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. When Jalen and his mother stepped out, no one pushed forward, no one shouted slogans. People simply stepped aside quietly, many nodding respectfully. In Jalen's hand was still his grandfather's old law book, its spine worn and pages yellowed. He held it tightly, a silent reminder that all knowledge, all journeys, begin in a small room where a boy read under the glow of a desk lamp, watched over by his grandfather's photo. That day didn't end with grand promises, but with a quiet ripple. People walked away feeling lighter, but also more responsible. And in their memory, the final image was of a small boy standing in a grand hall, reminding them that justice doesn't live in cold verdicts, but in the hearts of those who dare to face the truth. And so, Jalen's journey came full circle, from a child mocked in the courtroom to an honored guest within that very court, from someone dismissed to someone who inspired the world. His final message, simple, proud, without embellishment, became a guiding light, so that anyone holding a gavel, signing a judgment, or delivering a ruling would remember that young eyes are always watching, hoping truth will be protected to the end. After hearing many speeches from prominent legal figures, the moderator turned once again to Jalen, saying the room wanted to hear closing words from him. The atmosphere quieted, all eyes fixed on the 8-year-old in the front row. Jalen stood, his frame small but his voice strong and unwavering. Justice doesn't need age, only truth. The sentence, brief and unadorned, carried a weight that froze the entire hall in silence for a few seconds. It wasn't complex philosophy. It was an obvious truth spoken in a clear voice, without hesitation. The silence lasted long enough for everyone to absorb the message. Veteran judges seated high above leaned back in their chairs, their eyes bright as if their sense of responsibility had been reignited. Young lawyers in the room exchanged glances, their smiles tinged with emotion, because they understood that their chosen profession wasn't about defending interests, but about standing with the truth. Law students lining the aisles hurriedly scribbled down the quote, afraid it might slip away, because they knew it wasn't just a child's message. It was a compass for the long road ahead. Then, like a rising wave, the entire hall stood up in unison. Applause erupted, thundering against the thick walls and echoing all the way to the corridors beyond. It wasn't just praise. It was a collective acknowledgement that the words had touched the core of their belief. People no longer saw Jalen as a child, but as a voice of conscience, reminding them that justice isn't built on status or age, but on the courage to speak the truth. Judge Clark, who had presided over the original trial, joined in the applause. A clear smile appeared on his aged face, mixed with emotion, as if washing away all the biases he once carried. Jalen's mother sat below, tears streaming down her cheeks, clutching a small notebook filled with cherished moments. For her, the applause wasn't just for her son. It was confirmation that her family's faith had been restored, that truth had triumphed over deceit. The applause thundered on for so long that many in the room remained standing. Yet even when silence returned, the words still echoed in their minds. They would be repeated in future conferences, classrooms, academic papers, and in the lessons parents teach their children. And in that moment, an 8-year-old boy completed his journey, not with medals or accolades, but with the quiet power of a single sentence that made an entire courtroom rise and applaud like thunder, reminding everyone that justice only exists when truth is honored. The story of Jalen Brooks concluded in the resounding applause of the courtroom, but its resonance stretched far beyond those four walls. The journey of an 8-year-old boy, once mocked and dismissed, who became a global reminder that justice is rooted in truth, became a symbol of the power of courage. In the early days, Jalen had entered the courthouse beside his mother under looks of doubt and ridicule, called the kid who brought toys into a serious place. But from that very space, he spoke out boldly, exposing the lies of abusive officers and forcing the justice system to reconsider itself. That journey had its moments of high tension, when Jalen faced Prosecutor Keene, when he challenged false accusations, and when he identified fabricated evidence in a packed courtroom. Every word, every glance from him made the jury, the audience, and even Judge Clark stop and think. From the initial silence, the room gradually leaned in one direction until those who once mocked him were left speechless, unable to defend their position. Jalen didn't win through rebellion, but through reason and unwavering conviction. When the video clip of the courtroom exchange went viral, public reaction exploded. The social media movement, the slogans, and the involvement of lawyers and human rights organizations turned a small courtroom story into a national echo. The 8-year-old boy became an unexpected symbol, dubbed Kid Lawyer. But what moved people most was his simple statement: "I don't want to be a hero, I just want fairness." That sentence touched the hearts of millions, making them realize that truth doesn't need glory to have value. The ripple effect on the community was unmistakable. From Jalen's mother having her job and reputation restored, to neighbors changing how they looked at them, to schools using the case as a discussion topic. People hung banners in the streets with the message, "If a child can see it clearly, the law must not close its eyes." The movement spread from one small neighborhood to distant states, then beyond borders to other countries. Letters from children around the world filled Jalen's classroom, each scribbled line from young hearts proving that he had become a shared friend to millions of kids globally. The widespread attention forced international human rights groups and law schools to take serious notice. Jalen's video was shown at conferences, becoming a case study for discussions on children's rights and legal reform. Academics, politicians, and journalists all agreed that justice isn't bound by age. It was a lesson the world had been reminded of by an 8-year-old boy in an ordinary courtroom, where the truth was spoken so clearly that no one could ignore it. On a personal level, Jalen remained a boy who sat under a desk lamp every night, reading old law books left by his grandfather. The framed photo of his grandfather on the shelf seemed to watch over each turn of the page, reminding him that the greatest inheritance isn't money or fame, but a belief in justice. It's also a powerful image that brings the difficult journey to a quiet close, emphasizing that true courage begins with small things, in a small room, fueled by love for family. When Jalen returned to the courthouse as an honored guest, he was greeted with respect instead of contempt. Judge Clark, once skeptical, stood up to welcome him and admitted he had learned a valuable lesson. When Jalen said, "Justice doesn't need age, only truth," the entire courtroom rose in applause, not to celebrate him, but to agree with him. That statement summed up the whole story, both simple and profound, prompting everyone present to reflect on themselves. The lesson of Jalen Brooks's story isn't just about defeating lies, but about staying true to the truth. It reminds us that no one is too small to make a difference, that the clarity and courage of children can awaken the conscience of adults. It also shows that justice cannot be upheld by empty authority, but by trust, transparency, and honest voices. Viewers may conclude that in a turbulent society, what matters is not status or age, but the ability to face the truth and speak it out loud. If an 8-year-old boy can shift the course of a trial and ignite an international movement, then every adult can begin right where they stand. Justice does not need grand titles, but hearts ready to protect the truth, even when it is the simplest truth. And so, the story of Jalen Brooks leaves behind an enduring legacy. A small child can make the world rise and listen. It is a message to all of us that justice is not distant. It lives in a child's eyes, in acts of courage, and in the determination not to let truth be buried. When people look back on this story, they will not only remember a courtroom, but the unwavering gaze of Jalen and his simple message: justice doesn't need age, only truth.